The cold wind whipped through Cedar Ridge, carrying the scent of snow and the promise of another harsh Wyoming winter. Main Street stretched barely 3 blocks, lined with weathered buildings that leaned against each other like old soldiers sharing war stories. The year was 1875, a decade after the Civil War had torn the nation apart, leaving scars that still hadn't healed, especially in men like Jonas Reeves. "Stop, thief!" The shout cut through the morning air, drawing the attention of the handful of people going about their business. A small figure darted between wagons, clutching something to its chest, pursued by the portly figure of Silas Thornberry, owner of the town's only mercantile and self-appointed pillar of the community. Jonas watched from the doorway of his woodshop, a massive figure with shoulders broad enough to fill the frame. At 34, his dark hair was already streaked with premature gray, and his pale blue eyes held the empty look of a man who had seen too much and said too little. The sleeves of his rough cotton shirt were rolled up, revealing forearms corded with muscle and hands calloused from years of crafting furniture from the region's stubborn pine. "Somebody stop that girl!" Thornberry bellowed, his expensive coat flapping behind him like the wings of an ungainly bird. The thief was nothing more than a child, a girl no older than 7 barefoot, despite the autumn chill, wearing a dress that hung from her thin frame like a sail without wind. She clutched a small loaf of bread to her chest, as if it were gold. Jonas had no intention of getting involved. He'd spent 7 years in Cedar Ridge, building a quiet life where people left him alone with his ghosts. But as the girl ran past his shop, her eyes met his, not with fear, but with a fierce determination that stirred something long dormant in his chest. When Thornberry's clerk stuck out his foot to trip the child, Jonas moved before he could think better of it. With 2 long strides, he caught the girl before she hit the ground, steadying her with hands that could span her entire ribcage. "What's all this about?" His voice was rough from disuse, like a door with rusted hinges. "That little savage stole from Mr. Thornberry's store," the clerk said, a thin man with the perpetual expression of someone who'd been sucking lemons. Thornberry arrived red-faced and puffing. "Jonas Reeves, I should have known you'd interfere. That little vagabond has been stealing from me for weeks." The girl hadn't struggled in Jonas's grip, but she hadn't released the bread either. Up close, he could see the hollows in her cheeks and the dark circles under eyes too old for her young face. "Is that true?" Jonas asked the child, his voice gentler than anyone in town had heard it in years. She looked up at him, wheat-colored hair falling in tangles around a face that might have been pretty if it weren't so gaunt. "I was hungry," she said simply, with a dignity that struck him like a physical blow. "How much for the bread, Thornberry?" Jonas asked, not taking his eyes off the child. The merchant sniffed. 2 cents, but it's the principle of the matter. These orphans think they can just—" Jonas reached into his pocket and pulled out a nickel. "Here's for today and the next time." He tossed the coin to Thornberry, who caught it reflexively. "Now, is there anything else?" Thornberry's eyes narrowed, but with several townspeople watching, he had little choice but to accept the payment. "Keep that little thief away from my store," he muttered, before turning away, gesturing for his clerk to follow. Jonas looked down at the girl who was watching the exchange with startling awareness in her young eyes. "You got a name?" "Pearl," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Pearl Henderson." "You got somewhere to go?" "Pearl Henderson." She hesitated, then nodded toward the far end of town. "Mrs. Hutchkins' boarding house. But she says I eat too much for what I earn." Jonas frowned. Mabel Hutchkins was known for taking in orphans for the county stipend, though few stayed long under her care. "When did you last eat something besides that bread?" Pearl's silence was answer enough. Against his better judgment, Jonas nodded toward his shop. "Come on. I've got stew on the stove in the back. You can tell me how a girl your size could be eating too much of anything." The shop smelled of pine shavings and linseed oil, a clean scent that spoke of creation rather than decay. Jonas led Pearl to the small back room that served as both kitchen and living quarters during long workdays. A pot of venison stew simmered on the small stove. Pearl sat at the rough wooden table, her feet dangling well above the floor, watching as Jonas ladled stew into a bowl. He set it before her with a chunk of cornbread, then turned to wash wood stain from his hands, giving her privacy to fall upon the food with the restrained desperation of someone who had learned that showing hunger was a weakness. "Mrs. Hutchkins took me in after Mama and Papa died," Pearl said between careful bites, answering the question he hadn't asked. "Their wagon overturned at the creek crossing. Papa was thrown clear, but Mama—" She stopped, focusing on her spoon, as if it required all her concentration. "How long ago?" Jonas asked, his back still turned. "3 months, 2 weeks, and 4 days, she replied, with the precision of someone counting each hour. Jonas recognized grief when he heard it, the kind that marked time like notches on a prison wall. He'd done the same after Maria died. "And Mrs. Hutchkins, she treats you well." Pearl's silence made him turn. She was staring into her stew, her small shoulders tense. "She says I'm lucky she took me in. Says nobody wants a girl child, especially one that's too skinny to work proper." "What kind of work does she have you doing?" "Laundry mostly, and cleaning for the boarders. I start at 4 in the morning so I don't disturb nobody important." She said this with practiced matter-of-factness, as if it were perfectly normal for a 7-year-old to work before dawn. Jonas felt something stir in his chest, an old anger he thought he'd buried along with his wife and infant son. "And school?" Pearl shook her head. "Mrs. Hutchkins says school is for children, whose keep is paid for. I need to earn my bread." She looked up suddenly, eyes widening. "But I can read Mama taught me before." Her voice trailed off, but her chin lifted with pride. "I can read better than some grown folks." Jonas believed her. There was an intelligence in her gaze that belied her years and circumstances. He watched as she finished her stew with the careful precision of someone who knew that this meal might need to last. "Thank you for the stew, Mr. Reeves," she said when she'd finished, formal as a little lady at a society dinner. "And for paying Mr. Thornberry. I'll work it off if you have need of someone small to reach tight places or sweep up." "Just Jonas," he corrected automatically, "and there's no need. 5 cents won't break me." Pearl slid from the chair, her bare feet silent on the wooden floor. "I should get back. Mrs. Hutchkins counts the sheets at noon, and I'm still 3 short of my quota." Jonas wanted to stop her, to tell her that no child should be counting sheets instead of playing. But what right did he have to interfere? He was a broken man who could barely care for himself, let alone a child. "The back door's unlocked until 8, he found himself saying. "If you get hungry again." Pearl looked at him with those old eyes in a young face. "Thank you, Mr. Jonas," she said, then slipped out the front door like a shadow retreating from the sun. That night, Jonas sat alone in Murphy's saloon, nursing whiskey and memories. His fingers traced the outline of his father's brass compass in his vest pocket. The instrument hadn't pointed true north in years, but he carried it nonetheless, a reminder that even broken things had value. The usual crowd filled Murphy's, Doc Patterson playing solitaire in the corner, Sheriff Brennan making his evening rounds, Mavis O'Connell serving drinks with the efficiency of a woman who'd inherited a man's business in a world that didn't believe women should own property at all. "You're drinking more than usual tonight, Jonas," Mavis noted as she refilled his glass. At 40, with copper hair and sharp green eyes, she ran the saloon with more success than her late husband ever had. Jonas grunted noncommittally. "Heard you stepped in when Thornbury was making a scene this morning," she continued, undeterred by his silence. "That was the Henderson girl, wasn't it, poor little mite?" "You know of her?" Jonas asked, his interest piqued despite himself. Mavis nodded, wiping down the bar with practiced motions. "Came in on Henley's supply wagon about 3 months back. Found her out by Cooper's Creek, half-starved and talking to her dead parents. Mabel Hutchkins took her in." Her mouth twisted. Though took in and took care of are different matters entirely. "She works the girl like a slave," Jonas said, the whiskey loosening his tongue. "Had her barefoot in October, thin as a rail. That's Mabel's way. County pays her 30 cents a day for each orphan, but she makes sure they earn twice that in labor." Mavis's voice was bitter. "I offered to take the girl myself, but the county agent said a saloon was no place for a child. As if Mabel's sweatshop is any better." The batwing doors swung open, letting in a gust of cold air, and Sheriff Brennan. The lawman nodded to Jonas as he approached the bar. Though they'd both served in the Union Army, they maintained a careful distance. Brennan had been regular infantry, while Jonas had been part of a special reconnaissance unit whose actions were still classified in certain military records. "Evening, Mavis," Brennan said, settling his lean frame on a bar stool. "Usual, please." As Mavis poured his coffee, Brennan never drank alcohol while wearing his badge, the sheriff glanced at Jonas. "Heard you had a run-in with Thornbury today." Jonas shrugged. "Man was making a fuss over a hungry child." "That's Thornbury for you. Pillar of the community on Sunday, squeezing pennies from orphans on Monday." Brennan sipped his coffee. "Just watch yourself. Man's got connections in the territorial government. Been buying up land all over the county since the railroad survey came through." Jonas had little interest in politics or railroads. He finished his whiskey and stood to leave, dropping coins on the bar. As he pushed through the doors into the night air, he tried to put Pearl Henderson out of his mind. He had enough ghosts without adding a barefoot orphan to the collection. But when he returned to his cabin on the outskirts of town, he found himself laying out an extra blanket on the small cot in the corner of his workshop. Just in case, he told himself. Winter was coming, and nights got cold. 3 days passed before Pearl appeared again. Jonas was working late, finishing a rocking chair commissioned by Doc Patterson when the back door creaked open. Pearl stood in the doorway, her thin frame silhouetted against the night sky. She clutched a bundle to her chest, and even in the dim lamplight Jonas could see the darkening bruise on her cheek. "Mr. Jonas," her voice was small but steady. "Is your offer still good about the back door?" Jonas set down his tools and approached slowly as one might a wounded animal. "What happened to your face?" Pearl's hand went to her cheek, a reflexive gesture. "I dropped Mrs. Hutchkins's good china. It was an accident." Jonas felt that old anger rise again, hotter this time. "Come in. Sit by the stove while I finish up here." Pearl entered hesitantly, still clutching her bundle. As she settled on the small stool by the stove, Jonas noticed she was even thinner than before, her collarbones sharp beneath her threadbare dress. "Have you eaten today?" he asked, already knowing the answer. Pearl nodded, then shook her head, then looked ashamed. "Mrs. Hutchkins said I didn't earn my supper, but I'm not really hungry," she added quickly, though her eyes betrayed her when they fixed on the pot of beans on the stove. Jonas served her a bowl without comment, adding a hunk of cornbread and watching as she tried not to devour it too quickly. As she ate, he returned to the rocking chair, sanding the armrests with long, smooth strokes that filled the silence between them. "That's a pretty chair," Pearl said, eventually, her voice stronger after food. "Who's it for?" "Doc Patterson. His rheumatism acts up in winter." Pearl nodded as if this made perfect sense. "You make it smooth, so it doesn't catch on his clothes," she observed. "And the arms are wide, so his elbows have a place to rest." Jonas looked up, surprised by her perception. "That's right. Papa was a carpenter too before—" She trailed off, fingers tracing the grain of the wooden table. "He taught me that different woods have different grains, and you have to respect each one's nature if you want to build something that lasts." For the first time in longer than he could remember, Jonas felt a smile tug at the corner of his mouth. "Your papa was right about that." Pearl reached for her bundle, unwrapping it carefully. Inside was a small cloth doll crudely made from scraps, but lovingly stitched with button eyes and yarn for hair. "This is Hope," she said, introducing the doll with grave formality. "I made her from pieces the laundry ladies were throwing away." The doll was a testament to ingenuity born of desperation. Mismatched fabric, carefully sewn with tiny, even stitches, button eyes of different sizes that somehow gave the face character rather than oddity. "She's well made," Jonas said, recognizing craftsmanship when he saw it. "You've got steady hands." Pearl beamed at the praise, cradling the doll. "Hope keeps me company when things get scary," she confided. "She's brave, even when I'm not." Jonas wondered what terrors filled the nights of a 7-year-old orphan. He thought of Maria, how she'd died bringing their son into a world that had rejected him just hours later. He thought of the compass in his pocket, how it spun aimlessly, searching for a north it would never find. "You can sleep here tonight," he found himself saying, "on the cot in the corner. It's too late to go back to the boarding house." Pearl's eyes widened. "Mrs. Hutchkins counts heads at night. She'll know I'm gone. I'll speak to her in the morning. Tell her you were helping me with a project." Jonas didn't know why he was offering this, why he was inserting himself into a situation that could only bring complications. But the bruise on Pearl's cheek demanded a response, even from a man who'd spent years avoiding responsibility. Pearl hesitated, then nodded, exhaustion winning out over caution. Jonas showed her to the cot, adding another blanket when he saw her shiver. "Mr. Jonas," she asked as he turned to leave, "do you have bad dreams sometimes?" The question caught him off guard. "Sometimes," he admitted. "Me too," Pearl said, her voice small in the dim workshop. "About the creek, and Mama and Papa not waking up, and—" She trailed off, clutching Hope tighter. "Does it ever stop hurting the missing?" Jonas thought of Maria, of their son, who had lived just long enough for Jonas to hold him once. 7 years hadn't dulled that pain. It had only taught him to carry it silently. "No," he said honestly, "but you learn to live alongside it." Pearl nodded, as if this made perfect sense. "That's what I thought," she said, settling down with Hope tucked under her chin. "Good night, Mr. Jonas." "Good night, Pearl," he replied, turning down the lamp as he left. He sat outside on the porch for a long time, watching the stars wheel overhead, thinking about a child who had named her doll Hope and carried it like a talisman against darkness. Inside his vest pocket, his father's compass seemed to grow heavier, as if responding to a magnetic pull he couldn't yet identify. Dawn found Jonas at Mrs. Hutchkins's boarding house, a 3-story structure that had once been the grandest building in Cedar Ridge, but now is sagged with neglect. The peeling paint and rotting porch boards spoke of priorities that had nothing to do with comfort or safety. Mabel Hutchkins answered his knock with a scowl that deepened when she recognized him. At 50, She had the perpetually sour expression of someone who believed life had shortchanged her at every turn. "What do you want, Reeves?" she demanded, blocking the doorway with her substantial frame. "I'm here about Pearl Henderson," Jonas said, removing his hat as a courtesy that felt foreign after years of minimal social interaction. Mrs. Hutchins's eyes narrowed. "What's that little thief done now if she's stolen from you?" "She hasn't stolen anything," Jonas interrupted, "but she's at my workshop with a bruise on her face that needs explaining." "Children fall," Mrs. Hutchins said dismissively. "Clumsy little things. And that one's more trouble than most. Lazy, forgetful." "She's 7 years old," Jonas said, his voice dangerously quiet. "And from what I can see, she's working harder than most grown men in this town." "Are you telling me how to run my establishment, Mr. Reeves?" Mrs. Hutchins drew herself up, indignation overcoming caution. "The county entrusted that child to my care, and I'm teaching her valuable skills. Something you'd know nothing about being a childless widower who keeps to himself." The barb struck home, but Jonas didn't flinch. "I'm here to tell you that Pearl will be staying with me for a few days. She's helping with a special project." He reached into his pocket and pulled out $2, more than the county would pay for a week of Pearl's keep. "This should cover any inconvenience." Mrs. Hutchins eyed the money with naked greed. "2 days," she said, snatching the bills. "Then she's back here where she belongs. I've got responsibilities to the county and people watching to make sure I fulfill them." "What people?" Jonas asked, his instincts suddenly alert. A shadow passed over Mrs. Hutchins's face. "Important people, Mr. Reeves, the kind who notice when things aren't as they should be." She began to close the door. 2 days, then I expect her back clean and respectful." As the door shut in his face, Jonas stood on the sagging porch, turning Mrs. Hutchins's words over in his mind. There was something beneath the surface here, something that made the hairs on the back of his neck rise the way they had during the war when an ambush was imminent. He returned to the workshop to find Pearl awake, carefully folding the blankets on the cot. She had washed her face at the pump, though the bruise stood out starkly against her pale skin. "I spoke to Mrs. Hutchins," Jonas said. "You can stay here for a couple of days if you'd like. Help me with the rocking chair." Pearl's eyes widened. "Really? She won't be angry?" "I paid her for your time," Jonas said, unwilling to explain the concept of buying a child's freedom, however temporarily. Pearl approached him slowly, her small face serious. "Mr. Jonas, why are you helping me?" It was a fair question, one Jonas had been asking himself since that first encounter. He had spent 7 years avoiding connections, protecting himself from the pain that came with caring. Why risk that for a child he barely knew? "Everyone deserves a safe place to sleep," he said finally. "And decent food. That's all this is." Pearl studied him with those old eyes, clearly not believing it was that simple, but willing to accept the explanation for now. "I can help," she offered. "I can sweep and fetch water and sort nails. Papa taught me all the different kinds." "That would be useful," Jonas acknowledged, surprised to find he meant it. His workshop could use a good cleaning, and small hands might indeed reach places his couldn't. Over the next 2 days, a routine emerged. Pearl would wake early, help Jonas prepare a simple breakfast, then set to work organizing his tools and supplies while he focused on craftsmanship. She proved to be a quick learner, absorbing his instructions about different wood types and tool maintenance with an eagerness that spoke of genuine interest rather than mere compliance. In the evenings, Jonas found himself reading aloud from one of the few books he owned, a collection of frontier tales that had been Maria's favorite. Pearl would listen rapt, occasionally asking questions that revealed both her intelligence and the gaps in her education. On the morning Pearl was due to return to Mrs. Hutchkins, Jonas woke to find her already up sitting at the small table with Hope in her lap and a determined expression on her face. "Mr. Jonas," she said formally as he stirred the morning coffee, "I need to ask you something important." Jonas sat across from her, recognizing the gravity in her young voice. "What is it?" Pearl took a deep breath, then reached into the pocket of her dress and withdrew a single silver dollar, a treasure so unexpected that Jonas couldn't imagine how she'd acquired it. "Can I buy you?" she asked, placing the coin on the table between them. Jonas stared at the silver dollar, then at Pearl's face, earnest, hopeful, and terrified all at once. "What did you say?" "I want to buy you," Pearl repeated, her voice stronger now. "I know people can't really be bought. I'm not stupid. But I need a papa, and you look like you might need a daughter, and I thought maybe, if I offered you my most precious thing, you might consider it. Like a trade." The workshop seemed to grow very quiet, as if the world itself were holding its breath. Jonas could hear his own heartbeat, could feel his father's compass pressing against his ribs, as if trying to send him a message through the broken instrument. "Where did you get this?" he asked, gently, nodding at the silver dollar. "A traveling merchant came through town 3 weeks ago. He had lots of things for sale, but this caught the sunlight like a falling star." Pearl's fingers hovered protectively near the coin. "I traded my shoes for it. Mrs. Hutchkins was really mad, but I knew it was important, more important than keeping my feet warm." Jonas looked at Pearl's bare feet, then back at the silver dollar, a child's ransom paid with the only thing she had to trade. Something cracked open in his chest, something he'd kept locked away for 7 long years. "People can't be bought," he said, carefully watching Pearl's face begin to crumple. "Not with silver dollars, not with gold, not with all the money in the world." A tear rolled down Pearl's cheek, followed quickly by another. Her small shoulders began to shake, and Jonas felt each tremor like a physical blow. "But," he continued, and Pearl's eyes snapped back to his face with desperate hope, "that doesn't mean a man can't choose to be someone's family. Not because he was bought, but because he wants to be." The silence that followed was different, charged with possibility instead of despair. Pearl's tears stopped falling, though they still clung to her lashes like morning dew. "Do you think—" she began, then stopped, afraid to voice the question that had brought her here. Jonas reached into his vest pocket and pulled out the brass compass, its worn surface catching the morning light. He set it on the table beside Pearl's silver dollar. 2 broken things seeking redemption in each other's company. "This was my father's," he said quietly. "It doesn't point north anymore, hasn't for years. But I keep carrying it because sometimes the most important things in life aren't about knowing which direction you're headed. Sometimes they're about having something to hold on to when you feel lost." Pearl stared at the compass, then back at Jonas's face. "Are you lost, Mr. Jonas?" Jonas felt his throat tighten, but this time it wasn't from fear. It was from the strange, unfamiliar sensation of hope, trying to take root in soil that had been barren for too long. "I think I might have been," he admitted, "but I think maybe you just helped me find my way." As the sun rose over Cedar Ridge, casting long shadows through the workshop windows, a man who had been adrift for 7 years and a child who had lost everything made a silent pact over a silver dollar and a broken compass. Neither knew what challenges lay ahead, or how deeply their decision would be tested. But in that moment, 2 lost souls recognized something in each other that had been missing for far too long: the possibility of home. That afternoon, when Sheriff Brennan rode up to Jonas's workshop, the lawman's face was grim with news that would shatter their fragile new beginning. But that was still hours away, And for now, Pearl Henderson was teaching Jonas Reeves how to fold a paper boat, her laughter filling spaces in his heart he'd thought would stay empty forever. Sheriff Thomas Brennan dismounted with the careful precision of a man who'd spent most of his life in the saddle. At 45, his lean frame still carried the military bearing from his days in the Union cavalry, though lines of responsibility now creased his weathered face. He removed his hat as he approached Jonas's workshop, a gesture that immediately put Jonas on alert. Men like Brennan only removed their hats for funerals and bad news. "Jonas," the sheriff nodded, his eyes flickering to Pearl, who was carefully sweeping wood shavings into a neat pile. "Miss Henderson, might I have a word with you, Jonas, privately?" Pearl looked up her broom, pausing mid-stroke. The wariness that crossed her face spoke of a child who had learned that private adult conversations rarely boded well for orphans. "It's all right," Jonas assured her. "Keep sorting those wood scraps like I showed you. The cherry ones go in the special bin." As Pearl reluctantly returned to her task, Jonas stepped outside with Brennan pulling the door mostly closed behind them. "Something wrong, Sheriff?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. Brennan's weathered face was grim. "Got some questions about the Henderson girl. How long has she been staying with you?" "Few days," Jonas answered carefully. "She's been helping in the shop. Mrs. Hutchkins knows about it." "I'm sure she does," Brennan said, his tone making it clear what he thought of Mabel Hutchkins. "But that's not why I'm here. Had a telegram from the Territorial Marshal's office this morning. Seems someone's been looking for a little girl, matching Pearl's description." Jonas felt his muscles tense, the old battlefield instincts kicking in. "Who?" "Man named Silas Thornberry. The mercantile owner." Jonas frowned. "What's his interest in Pearl?" Brennan's eyes narrowed slightly. "Not our Thornberry. His brother from San Francisco. Says he's been searching for his niece for 5 years. Girl who'd be about Pearl's age now. Name of Margaret Thompson." Jonas glanced back toward the workshop, where Pearl's small shadow moved behind the wavy glass window. "That's not possible. Pearl's parents died in a wagon accident 3 months ago. Everyone in town knows that." "The Hendersons weren't her parents, Jonas. Not her birth parents, anyway." Brennan lowered his voice. "According to this telegram, the Hendersons took her from San Francisco 5 years ago. Kidnapped her." The word hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Jonas shook his head. "No, Frank Henderson was a good man. I didn't know him well, but he had honest eyes. He wouldn't steal a child." "Sometimes desperate people do desperate things," Brennan said. "Word is the Hendersons lost their own daughter to scarlet fever not long before they showed up out west with Pearl." Jonas's mind raced, sorting through the implications. If what Brennan said was true, if Pearl was really this Margaret Thompson, then she had a family, a blood family that had been searching for her. A family with a legal claim that would supersede any arrangement Jonas might make with Mrs. Hutchkins. "What happens now?" Jonas asked, his voice rough. "Silas Thornberry is on his way from San Francisco. Should arrive by week's end." Brennan replaced his hat, adjusting it against the strengthening wind. "Wanted to give you a heads up. Territorial Marshal may want to question the girl when Thornberry arrives. She's 7 years old, Tom. She's already lost 2 sets of parents. Now, you want to tell her the people who raised her were kidnappers?" Brennan's expression softened slightly. "I don't want to tell her anything of the sort. But if she is Margaret Thompson, her uncle has been searching for her for 5 years. Man has rights. And Pearl doesn't." Jonas felt that old anger rising, the kind that had once made him dangerous in battle. "She gets no say in being uprooted again. The law's clear on guardianship, Jonas. Blood relatives take precedence over other arrangements." Brennan's eyes traveled to the workshop, where Pearl's silhouette continued its methodical movement. For what it's worth, I think what you're doing for her is good. She looks better than she has since arriving in Cedar Ridge, but my job is to uphold the law. Jonas understood. Brennan was a man who lived by a code just as Jonas once had. The difference was that Jonas had seen his code shattered in the blood-soaked fields of Chickamauga, while Brennan's faith in justice remained intact. "Just give me time to prepare her," Jonas said. "If this Thornberry is coming to claim her, she deserves to know what's happening." Brennan nodded. "Fair enough. But Jonas—" He hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "Don't get too attached. If she is who they think she is, this isn't going to end the way you want it to." After Brennan rode away, Jonas stood on the porch for a long time, watching the clouds gather on the horizon. A storm was coming, both literally and figuratively, and he wasn't sure if the fragile shelter he'd built for Pearl would withstand it. Inside, he found Pearl exactly where he'd left her, carefully sorting wood scraps by type, just as he'd shown her. She looked up as he entered, her eyes searching his face. "Is everything all right, Mr. Jonas?" she asked, and he heard the careful neutrality in her voice, a child preparing herself for bad news. "Let's finish up here," he said, instead of answering directly. "Then I'll teach you how to use the lathe." Pearl's face lit up momentarily, forgetting her worry. "Really? You said that was for when I was bigger." "You're bigger than you were yesterday," Jonas replied, feeling a pang at the joy such a simple thing could bring her. "And you've got steady hands. That's more important than size." For the rest of the afternoon, Jonas showed Pearl how to hold the chisel against the spinning wood, guiding her small hands with his large ones. Her concentration was absolute. Her tongue caught between her teeth as she focused on creating something from nothing. When they finished, she held up a small wooden top roughly made, but undeniably her own creation. "I made this," she said with wonder, spinning it on the workbench. "All by myself." "And you did?" Jonas confirmed, watching her face glow with pride. "First of many things if you keep practicing." As they prepared a simple supper of beans and cornbread, Jonas considered how to tell Pearl about Brennan's visit. How did you explain to a child that everything she believed about her past might be a lie? That the parents she mourned might have stolen her from another family? "Pearl," he began as they sat at the small table, "do you remember anything about your life before the Hendersons? Before Frank and Mary?" Pearl looked up from her plate, her fork pausing mid-bite. "Before Mama and Papa?" she asked, confused. "There wasn't any before. They were always my Mama and Papa." "Are you sure? You would have been very young, about 2, but sometimes people remember things from that age." Pearl's brow furrowed in concentration. "I remember a big water," she said slowly, "bigger than the creek, and tall houses all pressed together like books on a shelf. But that might have been a dream." Jonas felt his heart sink. San Francisco sat on a bay with buildings crowded along steep hills, a fair description of big water, and houses pressed together like books. "Why are you asking Mr. Jonas? Did I do something wrong?" "No, Pearl. You didn't do anything wrong." Jonas set his fork down, choosing his words carefully. "But there's something I need to tell you. Something Sheriff Brennan told me today." He explained as gently as he could, watching Pearl's face as she tried to process information that would confuse even an adult. He told her about the telegram, about Silas Thornberry's claim that she was really Margaret Thompson, about the possibility that the Hendersons had taken her from her birth family. Pearl listened without interrupting, her small face growing increasingly pale. When Jonas finished, she sat in silence for a long moment, her food forgotten. "That can't be right," she finally said, her voice small but determined. "Mama and Papa wouldn't steal anybody. They were good people. They taught me to always tell the truth and never take what isn't mine." "I believe you," Jonas said, and he meant it. But sometimes, adults do things that don't make sense to children. Sometimes, they make mistakes. "It wasn't a mistake," Pearl insisted, her eyes filling with tears. "I was their little girl. They loved me." "I'm sure they did," Jonas said gently. "And nothing changes that love, no matter what happened before." Pearl wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, her face setting into the determined expression Jonas had come to recognize. "I won't go with this Mr. Thornberry. I don't know him. He's not my family." "It's complicated, Pearl. If he's your blood uncle—" "Blood doesn't make family," Pearl interrupted with a wisdom beyond her years. "Love does. That's what Mama always said." Jonas couldn't argue with that. Hadn't he been thinking the same thing when Pearl had offered him her silver dollar? When she had asked him to choose to be her family? "We'll figure it out," he promised, though he had no idea how to keep such a promise. "For now, nothing changes. You stay here, we work in the shop, and we take each day as it comes." That night, as Pearl slept on the cot in the corner, Jonas sat at his workbench, turning his father's compass over in his hands. The needle spun aimlessly, searching for a magnetic north it could no longer detect. Jonas felt a kinship with the broken instrument. For 7 years he'd been spinning just as aimlessly, unable to find direction after losing Maria and their son. But now, with Pearl's arrival, the needle had begun to steady. He'd found purpose in protecting this child, in teaching her, in watching her grow stronger each day, away from Mrs. Hutchkins's cruelty. The thought of losing her to a stranger from California made his chest tighten with a pain he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. A sound from the corner drew his attention. Pearl was whimpering in her sleep, her small body tense beneath the blankets. Jonas moved to her side, hesitating before gently placing his hand on her shoulder. "It's all right," he murmured. "You're safe." Pearl's eyes flew open wild with fear. "They're coming," she gasped. "The bad men, they're coming to take me away." "It was just a dream," Jonas soothed, though he wondered if it was prophetic. "No one's taking you anywhere." Pearl clutched at his arm, her grip surprisingly strong. "Promise me," she demanded. "Promise you won't let them take me." Jonas knew better than to make promises he might not be able to keep. In war, he'd learned that some forces were too powerful to stand against, like the artillery that had decimated his unit at Chickamauga, leaving him one of only 3 survivors. But looking into Pearl's desperate eyes, he found himself nodding. "I promise." He said the words, a weight and a lifeline both. "Now try to get some sleep. Tomorrow we start on Doc Patterson's bookshelf." As Pearl settled back down, clutching hope to her chest, Jonas returned to his chair by the stove. He had no legal claim to Pearl, no standing against a blood relative with documentation and the territorial law on his side. But he had made a promise, and for the first time in 7 years he had something, someone, worth fighting for. Dawn broke with a heavy mist that clung to the buildings of Cedar Ridge like a shroud. Jonas rose early, his sleep having been fitful and filled with dreams of battlefields and lost children. He found Pearl already awake, carefully combing her wheat-colored hair with the tortoiseshell comb he'd given her. "Good morning, Mr. Jonas," she said, her voice steadier than it had been the night before. "I'm ready to help with Doc Patterson's bookshelf." Jonas marveled at her resilience. How many blows could one small heart take before it broke beyond repair? Yet here she was, chin up ready to face whatever the day might bring. They were halfway through breakfast when the knock came. 3 sharp raps that made Pearl freeze her spoon halfway to her mouth. Jonas rose, gesturing for her to stay seated as he approached the door. Mavis O'Connell stood on his porch, her copper hair pulled back in a hasty bun, her expression troubled. "Jonas," she said without preamble, "you need to come to town. There's a man at Murphy's asking questions about Pearl. Says he's her uncle." Jonas felt his stomach clench. "Thornberry's here already. Brennan said he wouldn't arrive until week's end." "Not Thornberry himself," Mavis corrected. "Someone working for him. A man named Maddox. Cold eyes, expensive clothes that don't quite fit right. Carrying a fancy pistol and a lot of questions." Behind him, Jonas heard Pearl's spoon clatter to the table. He turned to find her standing pale as milk. Hope clutched to her chest. "I know that name," she whispered. "Maddox. He used to come to our farm before. Papa always made me hide when he came." Jonas and Mavis exchanged glances. "What did he want with your Papa, Pearl?" Jonas asked gently. Pearl shook her head. "I don't know. They would talk in the barn and Papa would come back angry. Once I heard them shouting. Maddox said Papa had taken something that wasn't his, and Papa said he'd die before giving it back." The implications hung in the air between the adults. If the Hendersons had indeed taken Pearl from her family in San Francisco, it made sense that someone might have been tracking them, demanding her return. "What does he look like, this Maddox?" Jonas asked Mavis, his mind already calculating options. "Tall, thin, but wiry. Salt and pepper hair cut short. Has a scar that runs from his left eye down to his jawline." Mavis's eyes darted to Pearl. "Calls himself a private investigator, but he moves like something else. Military, maybe, or worse." Jonas recognized the description, not of the man himself, but of the type. During the war, both sides had employed men who operated in the shadows, carrying out missions that regular soldiers couldn't or wouldn't. Men who became comfortable with moral ambiguity. Men like Jonas had almost become. Pearl needs to stay out of sight, Jonas decided. "Mavis, can you take her to Doc Patterson's? Tell him what's happening. He can keep her at his surgery while I find out what this Maddox wants." Mavis nodded. "Doc's already involved. He's the one who sent me to warn you. Said something about this not adding up." "What doesn't add up?" Jonas asked. "The timing," Mavis replied. "If this girl was taken 5 years ago, why is Thornberry only finding her now? And why send someone ahead instead of coming himself to claim his long-lost niece?" Valid questions, Jonas thought. Questions that made the hairs on the back of his neck rise again. "Pearl, go with Miss O'Connell," he instructed, kneeling to look the child in the eye. "Stay with Doc Patterson until I come for you. Don't talk to anyone else. And don't go anywhere alone. Understand?" Pearl nodded, her eyes wide, but her chin set in that determined line. "Are you going to talk to Mr. Maddox?" "I'm going to find out what he wants," Jonas hedged, "and make sure he understands that no one's taking you anywhere without proper proof and procedure." As Mavis led Pearl out the back way, Jonas reached for his coat, the heavy wool one he rarely wore because it reminded him of his uniform. In the pocket, his fingers found what they were seeking. The brass knuckles he'd carried since Chickamauga, a reminder of what he was capable of when pushed too far. He hoped he wouldn't need them today, but hope was a luxury he'd learned not to count on. Murphy's was unusually busy for mid-morning. Jonas spotted the stranger immediately, a lean, hard-looking man in clothes too fine for Cedar Ridge, but too worn for San Francisco high society. He sat at a corner table nursing a whiskey, and watching the door with the patient alertness of a predator. The scar Mavis had mentioned ran like a pale river down the left side of his face, disappearing into his collar. His right hand rested casually near his hip, where an expensive pistol gleamed in a tooled leather holster. Jonas approached directly, seeing no advantage in subterfuge. The man's eyes, cold and assessing, tracked his movement across the room. "You Maddox?" Jonas asked, stopping at the table but not sitting. The man smiled, though the expression didn't reach his eyes. "And you must be Jonas Reeves, the war hero turned carpenter." He gestured to the chair across from him. "Join me. I believe we have matters of mutual interest to discuss." Jonas remained standing. "I heard you're looking for Pearl Henderson." "Margaret Thompson," Maddox corrected smoothly. "Though I understand she's been using an alias. Unfortunate business child abduction leaves scars that never quite heal." His finger traced the line on his face, as if to emphasize the point. "You have proof she's this Margaret Thompson?" Jonas challenged. Maddox reached into his coat, producing a folded document, which he placed on the table. "Court order from San Francisco, authorizing the return of Margaret Thompson to her legal guardian, Silas Thornberry. And this," he added another paper, "is my authorization to act as Mr. Thornberry's agent in this matter." Jonas glanced at the documents without touching them. They looked official enough with proper seals and signatures, but they told him nothing about whether Pearl would be safe with this Thornberry or his agent. "Where is Mr. Thornberry? Why isn't he here himself?" "Business responsibilities," Maddox replied with a dismissive wave. "When you're overseeing mining interests across 3 states, personal travel becomes a luxury. Hence, my employment." "Convenient," Jonas remarked. "So you expect me to hand over a 7-year-old child to a stranger with some papers without meeting her supposed uncle or having any assurance of her welfare?" Maddox's smile thinned. "I expect you to comply with a legal court order, Mr. Reeves, unless you prefer to explain to a territorial judge why you're interfering with a family reunification. I understand Judge Harrison takes a dim view of men who keep children from their rightful guardians." The threat was clear, but something in Maddox's manner raised Jonas's suspicions further. The man was too smooth, too practiced, and there was an eagerness beneath his professional demeanor. Not the eagerness of someone reuniting a child with her family, but the satisfaction of a man completing a job with a substantial reward. "I'm not interfering with anything," Jonas said carefully. "I'm just making sure everything is in order before a child who's already suffered tremendous loss is uprooted again." "Noble," Maddox said, the word dripping with sarcasm, "but unnecessary. The law is clear on this matter. The girl belongs with her blood family." "Now, where is she?" "Safe," Jonas replied. "And she'll stay that way until I speak with Sheriff Brennan about these documents and we receive confirmation from San Francisco." Maddox's expression hardened. "Don't make this difficult, Reeves. I know about your war record, the reconnaissance missions, the commendations, the incidents. A man with your history should understand the value of following orders." The reference to Jonas's military past, particularly the vague mention of incidents, was deliberate, a reminder that Jonas too had secrets that could be exposed. "We're not at war anymore," Jonas said evenly, "and I don't take orders from private investigators. If Pearl is indeed Margaret Thompson, and if Silas Thornberry is indeed her lawful guardian, then proper procedures will be followed. Until then, she stays where she is." Maddox leaned forward, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Let me be clear, Reeves. I'm leaving Cedar Ridge with that girl one way or another. How much trouble accompanies that departure is entirely up to you." Onés felt the old battle readiness surge through him, the heightened awareness, the calculation of angles and distances, the assessment of threats and responses. He leaned down, placing his palms flat on the table, his face inches from Maddox's. "Let me be equally clear," he said, his voice steady and cold as a winter creek. "If you come near Pearl without Sheriff Brennan and proper documentation, you'll learn firsthand why the Confederate scouts called me the Ghost. I didn't earn that name for being easy to find or forget." He straightened, noting with satisfaction the flicker of uncertainty in Maddox's eyes. The man had done his research on Jonas's military record, but records only told part of the story. They didn't convey what Jonas had been capable of when protecting his men, or what he might still be capable of when protecting Pearl. "You have until sundown to present your case to Sheriff Brennan," Jonas continued. "After that, I suggest you return to San Francisco and tell Mr. Thornberry that if he wants to claim his niece, he should come do it himself." As Jonas turned to leave, Maddox called after him, "This isn't over, Reeves. That girl is worth more than you know." Jonas paused, looking back over his shoulder. Worth an interesting choice of words for a family matter. Maddox's expression revealed nothing, but Jonas had seen what he needed to see. A flash of calculation in those cold eyes. This wasn't about reuniting a child with her loving family. This was about something else entirely. As Jonas stepped out into the misty morning, he spotted Sheriff Brennan approaching from the direction of his office, his expression grim. "I see you've met our visitor," Brennan said, nodding toward Murphy's. "I have," Jonas confirmed. "Something's not right, Tom. He talks about Pearl like she's property, to be claimed, not a child to be cared for." Brennan sighed. "I sent a telegram to the marshal's office in San Francisco first thing this morning. Asked for verification of Thornberry's claim and Maddox's authority. Should have a response by tomorrow. And until then, we proceed carefully. I've already told Maddox he can't remove the child from Cedar Ridge without my authorization." Brennan lowered his voice. "Between us, Jonas, I don't like this any more than you do. A man who truly cared about finding his missing niece would come himself, not send someone like Maddox." "My thoughts exactly," Jonas agreed. "Pearl mentioned that Maddox used to visit the Hendersons' farm. Said her father would make her hide when he came." Brennan's eyes narrowed. "That puts a different light on things. If Maddox was tracking the Hendersons for years, why didn't he act before they died? Why wait until the girl was alone and vulnerable? Because now there's no one to contradict whatever story they're spinning," Jonas realized. No one except a 7-year-old girl whose memories might be questioned. "I need to speak with Pearl," Brennan decided. "See what else she remembers about Maddox and these visits." "She's at Doc Patterson's," Jonas said. "Mavis took her there this morning when we heard Maddox was asking questions." As they turned toward the doctor's surgery, Jonas caught a glimpse of movement in the alley beside Murphy's. A shadow detaching itself from deeper shadows. Maddox slipping out the side door, heading not toward the sheriff's office, as might be expected, but toward the outskirts of town. Toward Mrs. Hutchkins' boarding house. "Tom," Jonas murmured, nodding toward the alley, "our friend is making house calls." Brennan followed his gaze, his hand instinctively moving to the pistol at his hip. "Let him go. Better to know what he's up to than tip our hand." Jonas wasn't so sure. Every instinct told him that Maddox was dangerous, not just physically, but in the way of men who calculated odds and values with no regard for human cost. Men who saw people as means to ends rather than ends in themselves. Men who would think nothing of using a child as leverage. "I'm going to Doc's," Jonas said. "Make sure Pearl's safe. You follow Maddox, see what he's after at the boarding house." Brennan nodded, his expression somber. Jonas, be careful. Men like Maddox don't operate alone. If Thornberry has the kind of money and influence the documents suggest, there could be others we haven't seen yet. The warning sent a chill down Jonas's spine. During the war, he'd learned that visible enemies were far less dangerous than the ones who remained hidden, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. As he hurried toward Doc Patterson's surgery, Jonas felt the weight of his father's compass in his vest pocket. For the first time in years, he found himself praying, not to a god he'd long since lost faith in, but to whatever forces might be listening, that he wasn't already too late to keep his promise to Pearl. That he wasn't about to lose the one thing that had finally given his broken compass direction. Doc Patterson's surgery occupied the ground floor of a modest two-story building on Cedar Ridge's main street. Unlike the weathered structures surrounding it, the doctor's office was meticulously maintained, a testament to the man's belief that healing began with order and cleanliness. Jonas took the porch steps 2 at a time, his senses alert for any sign of trouble. He knocked once, then twice more in quick succession, an old signal from his military days that somehow felt appropriate now. The door opened a crack, and Doc Patterson's weathered face appeared. At 65, with a shock of white hair and penetrating gray eyes, the doctor had seen Cedar Ridge grow from a mining camp to a proper town. He'd also patched up Jonas after Chickamauga, when the young soldier had been carried in more dead than alive. "Jonas," he said, opening the door wider. "Was expecting you. Come in." The surgery was warm and smelled of carbolic soap and herbs. Pearl sat at a small table in the corner, carefully grinding something in a mortar under Mavis's watchful eye. She looked up as Jonas entered, her face lighting with relief. "Mr. Jonas, did you see the bad man? Is he gone?" Jonas exchanged glances with Doc and Mavis before approaching Pearl. "I saw him," he confirmed, kneeling to her level. "He's talking to Sheriff Brennan now. Everything's all right." "He's not a good person," Pearl said with the absolute certainty of a child. "He made Papa afraid, and Papa wasn't afraid of anything." Doc Patterson pulled up a chair, his movements deliberate as he settled his arthritic frame. "Pearl's been telling us about these visits from Maddox. Seems he's been tracking the Hendersons for years." "Did he say why he was looking for you, Pearl?" Jonas asked gently. Pearl shook her head, her small fingers still working the pestle. "He never talked to me, but I heard him once when I was hiding in the loft. He told Papa that they wanted me back, and Papa said they'd have to kill him first." Her voice faltered. "And then they did." A heavy silence fell over the room. Jonas felt a cold dread settle in his stomach. "Pearl, are you saying Maddox had something to do with your parents' accident?" Pearl's eyes filled with tears. "It wasn't an accident. The wagon wheel was fine the day before. Papa checked all the wheels every morning. He was careful like that." A tear slipped down her cheek. "After the accident, when I was waiting with them, hoping they'd wake up, I saw the wheel. It was cut almost all the way through." Jonas looked at Doc Patterson, whose grave expression confirmed he was thinking the same thing. If Pearl was right, the Hendersons hadn't died in an accident. They'd been murdered. "Why didn't you tell anyone this before?" Mavis asked gently. "Because the man who found me, Mr. Henley, he looked at the wheel and said something about poor craftsmanship, and these things happen." Pearl's voice took on the mimicking tone of a child repeating an adult's words. "I thought maybe I was wrong. Maybe, And then Mrs. Hutchkins said I shouldn't tell stories or people would think I was crazy like my mama." "Your mama wasn't crazy," Jonas said firmly. "That's what Papa always said too. But other people whispered about her, said she had spells where she'd talk about things that weren't there." Pearl's brow furrowed. "But Mama wasn't crazy. She just remembered things differently than Papa did." Jonas exchanged another look with Doc Patterson. What kind of things did she remember differently? Pearl shrugged her small shoulders. Things about me when I was little. She'd tell stories about when I was a baby, and Papa would get real quiet. Once I heard them arguing about it. Mama said I should know the truth, and Papa said the truth would only hurt everyone. The pieces were starting to fit together, though the picture they formed was darker than Jonas had anticipated. If Mary Henderson had been mentally unstable, as the town gossip suggested, perhaps she'd convinced her husband to take a child that wasn't theirs. Or perhaps she'd known the truth all along, while Frank had maintained the lie. "Pearl," Doc Patterson said gently, "do you remember anything about San Francisco? A big city by the ocean with tall houses built on hills." Pearl's hands stilled on the mortar. "I told Mr. Jonas about the big water and the houses like books on a shelf, but that's just dreams. I've always lived on the farm with Mama and Papa." "Dreams can be memories sometimes," Doc explained, "especially from when we were very young." Pearl looked uncertain, her fingers finding Hope, who sat propped against the mortar. "I remember a lady with red hair who sang to me. Not Mama. Her hair was yellow like mine. This lady had hair like fire and she smelled like flowers." "Do you remember her name?" Jonas asked. Pearl shook her head. "I just called her Lady. But she was sad a lot. She cried when she thought I was sleeping." Doc Patterson made a notation in the small book he kept for patient observations. "Anything else? Perhaps a house or other people?" Pearl's face scrunched in concentration. "There was a man with a big voice who brought me candy. He had a beard that tickled when he kissed my cheek." Her eyes widened suddenly. "And he had a special name for me, not Pearl, something else." "Margaret," Jonas suggested. "No, Maggie. He called me his little Maggie." Pearl looked confused. "But that's not my name." Before anyone could respond, the surgery door burst open. Sheriff Brennan stood in the doorway, his normally composed face flushed with exertion and anger. "Maddox is gone," he announced. "Rode out of town like the devil himself was on his heels." "What happened?" Jonas demanded, rising to his feet. "I followed him to the boarding house. He was talking to Mrs. Hutchkins, giving her money, a lot of it." Brennan's jaw tightened. "When I confronted him, he claimed it was payment for information about the child. But when I pressed, Mrs. Hutchkins admitted he'd been paying her for months to keep an eye on Pearl and report any visitors." Mavis swore under her breath, earning a sharp look from Doc Patterson. "Sorry," she muttered, glancing at Pearl. "But that explains why Mabel was so eager to keep Pearl under her roof, despite complaining about her constantly." "There's more," Brennan continued grimly. "I searched Maddox's room at the hotel after he left. Found this." He held up a folded document. "It's a deed to the Henderson property, or what's going to be the Henderson property once the territorial government processes it. Signed over to Silas Thornberry 3 weeks ago." "That's impossible," Jonas said. "The Hendersons died 3 months ago. Who would have signed it?" "That's the interesting part," Brennan replied, unfolding the document. "It bears the signature of one Margaret Thompson, legal heir to the Henderson estate, with Silas Thornberry as her guardian." All eyes turned to Pearl, who looked bewildered by the adult's intensity. "But I didn't sign anything," she protested. "And Papa always said the farm would be mine when I grew up. He promised." "The signature is forged," Brennan confirmed. "Poorly at that. But it would have been enough to claim the land if no one looked too closely." Jonas's mind raced, connecting threads that had seemed disparate before. "The railroad," he said suddenly. "Thornberry's buying land for the railroad route." Brennan nodded. "That's my guess. The survey team came through last spring marking possible routes for the transcontinental expansion." The Henderson farm sits at a critical junction where the line would need to cross Cooper's Creek. So this isn't about Pearl at all, Mavis realized. It's about the land. They're using her claim as Margaret Thompson to take control of property that will be worth a fortune once the railroad comes through. Not just the Henderson farm, Doc Patterson added quietly. If Pearl is indeed Margaret Thompson, she might have claim to other properties through her birth parents. Thornberry could be using her identity to consolidate multiple holdings. Jonas looked at Pearl, who was following the conversation with a furrowed brow, clearly trying to understand the adult complexities surrounding her fate. His heart ached for her, a child caught in a web of greed and deception, her very identity a pawn in someone else's game. "What happens now?" he asked Brennan. "Maddox is gone, but he'll be back, probably with reinforcements." "I've sent telegrams to the territorial marshal and to San Francisco," Brennan replied. "Asked for clarification about Thornberry's claim and verification of his legal guardianship. Until we hear back, Pearl stays here in Cedar Ridge under my protection as sheriff." "And under mine," Jonas added firmly. Pearl slid from her chair and moved to Jonas's side, her small hand finding his. "I want to stay with Mr. Jonas," she declared. "He promised he wouldn't let them take me." Brennan's expression softened as he looked at the child. "No one's taking you anywhere without proper legal procedures, Miss Pearl. That's a promise from me as well." As they prepared to leave Doc's surgery, with plans for Pearl to return to Jonas's workshop, under the watchful eye of both Brennan and Mavis, a commotion outside drew their attention. Raised voices, the sound of horses, and then a sharp knock at the doctor's door. Doc Patterson opened it cautiously to reveal one of Brennan's deputies, a young man named Cooper, whose face was flushed with urgency. "Sheriff, there's a lady at the office asking about the Henderson girl. Says she's got information about her real identity." Brennan straightened. "What kind of information?" "Don't know, sir. She wouldn't tell me. Said she'd only speak to whoever's caring for the child." Cooper's eyes moved to Pearl, then back to Brennan. "She seems proper enough, well-dressed, educated speech. But she's nervous, keeps looking over her shoulder like she's expecting trouble." Jonas and Brennan exchanged glances. It could be a trap. Maddox might have left town only to circle back with reinforcements. But it could also be a legitimate lead, someone with knowledge that might help protect Pearl from Thornberry's machinations. "I'll go," Jonas decided. "Pearl stays here with Doc and Mavis." "I'm coming with you," Brennan countered. "If this is some play by Maddox or Thornberry, better to face it together." Jonas nodded, then knelt to Pearl's level. "I need you to stay here with Doc and Miss O'Connell," he explained. "Sheriff Brennan and I are going to talk to this lady, see what she knows." Pearl's eyes widened with fear. "What if it's a trick? What if they take you away like they took Mama and Papa?" Jonas felt his heart clench at her fear. "No one's taking me anywhere," he promised. "And no one's taking you either. We're just going to talk and then I'll come right back. Doc won't let anything happen to you." "That's right," Doc Patterson affirmed, placing a gnarled hand on Pearl's shoulder. "Besides, I need your help grinding more yarrow for my remedies. You've got the steadiest hands of anyone in this surgery." Pearl hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. "You'll come right back." "As soon as I can," Jonas promised. The sheriff's office was a small but sturdy building at the center of Cedar Ridge. Its thick walls built to withstand both weather and the occasional attempt by drunken cowboys to liberate imprisoned friends. As Jonas and Brennan approached, Jonas noted the fine bay mare hitched outside, a horse that spoke of money and careful breeding out of place in the frontier town. Inside, a woman stood with her back to the door, gazing out the window as if keeping watch. She turned as they entered, and Jonas was struck by her appearance, tall and elegant, in a traveling suit of dark blue wool, with copper hair pulled back in a severe bun and eyes the color of storm clouds. She was perhaps 40, with the kind of beauty that came from character rather than mere features. "Sheriff Brennan," she inquired, her voice cultured but with an underlying tension. "Yes, ma'am, and this is Jonas Reeves, who's been caring for Pearl Henderson." The woman's eyes moved to Jonas, assessing him with surprising intensity. "You're the carpenter," she said, "the one who fought at Chickamauga." Jonas stiffened. "How do you know that—" "I make it my business to know who's caring for my goddaughter," she replied. "My name is Clara Wellington. I was Sarah Thompson's closest friend and Margaret's godmother." Brennan gestured to the chairs by his desk. "Please, Mrs. Wellington, have a seat. You understand we need to proceed cautiously. We've already had one individual claiming connection to the child." "Silas Thornberry," Clara said with obvious distaste as she settled into the offered chair. "Or more likely his bloodhound Maddox. Yes, I expected as much. That's why I'm here." "You know Thornberry?" Jonas asked, remaining standing, his instincts still wary despite the woman's seeming legitimacy. "Unfortunately, yes. He's Sarah Thompson's brother, Margaret's uncle by blood, but blood doesn't always signify care or concern." Clara withdrew a small leather portfolio from her handbag. "Sarah Thompson died 5 years ago, shortly after her husband Thomas. The official report was influenza, but there were suspicions." "What kind of suspicions?" Brennan inquired. "The kind that are difficult to prove when the deceased was already in poor health and her brother is a man of influence." Clara's tone was bitter. Sarah had been unwell since Thomas's death, a mining accident that was itself surrounded by questions. Too many coincidences for comfort, especially when Silas stood to gain control of Thomas's considerable holdings. Except he didn't gain control, Jonas surmised, because of Margaret. Clara nodded. "Precisely. Thomas Thompson left everything to his daughter with a trust managed by a board of executors, not by Silas. It drove him to distraction. He challenged the will, of course, but Thomas had been meticulous. The only way Silas could access the fortune was as Margaret's legal guardian, which he became after Sarah died," Brennan concluded. "Yes, but only briefly. 2 weeks after Sarah's funeral, Margaret disappeared from the Thornberry estate. The nanny, a young woman named Mary, disappeared as well, along with her husband Frank, who worked as a groundskeeper." "The Hendersons," Jonas said, the pieces falling into place. "They didn't kidnap her. They rescued her." Clara's eyes filled with tears. Mary Henderson was Sarah's confidant. Sarah knew she was dying, knew what her brother was capable of. She made Mary promise to protect Margaret if anything happened to her. She opened the portfolio, removing a faded envelope. "She left this letter with me to be opened only if something happened to both her and Margaret. When I heard about a child matching Margaret's description being found near Cooper's Creek, I knew it was time." Brennan accepted the letter, breaking the seal carefully. His eyes moved across the faded handwriting, his expression growing increasingly grave. "It's a deathbed confession," he said finally. "Sarah Thompson believed her husband's death was no accident, that Silas had arranged it to gain control of the Thompson mining interests. She feared she would be next, and that Margaret would be in danger once Silas realized the trust couldn't be broken while the child lived." "Are you suggesting Thornberry would harm his own niece?" Jonas asked, though the evidence was pointing toward a conclusion too terrible to voice. "Not directly," Clara replied. "Silas keeps his hands clean, but accidents happen especially to small children in large houses with steep staircases, or to families traveling through dangerous territory." Jonas thought of the wagon wheel Pearl had described, cut nearly through, ensuring catastrophe. "Like the Hendersons," he said grimly. "Maddox found them." "It appears so," Clara confirmed. "I've been searching for Mary and Frank, and for Margaret, since they disappeared. I knew they had headed west, but the trail went cold in Denver. It wasn't until I heard rumors of Silas suddenly taking interest in Wyoming property that I connected the pieces." "The railroad," Brennan said. "He's using Margaret's identity to claim land along the proposed route." "Among other holdings," Clara added. "The Thompson Trust includes mining claims across 3 states, timber rights in Oregon, and controlling interest in a shipping company. All told, Margaret Thompson is one of the wealthiest children in California, if she can be legally proven to be Margaret Thompson." The implications hung in the air between them. Pearl, or Margaret, was more than just a child caught in a custody dispute. She was the key to a fortune, and Silas Thornberry had already demonstrated he would stop at nothing to control that fortune. "How do we protect her?" Jonas asked the question, directed as much to himself as to the others. Before Clara could respond, the door burst open. Cooper stood there, his young face pale with shock. "Sheriff, Doc Patterson's surgery. There's been an attack. The doc's hurt bad, and Miss O'Connell too. The girl is gone." Jonas felt the world tilt beneath his feet. "What? Who took her? Maddox?" Cooper gasped. "He came back with 3 men. They overpowered Doc, and Miss O'Connell took the girl. Doc managed to get a shot off, winged one of them, but they still got away." Jonas was already moving, his mind shifting to the cold, calculated space he'd occupied during reconnaissance missions. "Which way did they go?" "North toward Cooper's Creek. They've got about 15 minutes head start." Brennan was reaching for his rifle. His expression hardened into the soldier he'd once been. "Cooper, get a posse together. 5 men, good riders, armed. Clara, stay here where it's safe." "I'm coming with you," Clara insisted, rising to her feet with determination. "Margaret knows my voice. She might remember me." "It's too dangerous," Brennan argued. "I've been searching for that child for 5 years, Clara countered. "I'm not sitting safely behind while she's in danger." Jonas was already at the door, his mind racing through calculations of distance, terrain, and pursuit strategies. "We need to move now," he said, his voice carrying the authority that had once commanded men in battle. "They'll head for the territorial border. Once they cross into Dakota, they're beyond your jurisdiction, Sheriff." "My horse is fresh," Clara offered, "and I can ride as well as any man in this town." Brennan hesitated only a moment before nodding. "Jonas, take my bay. He's faster than your draft horse. Cooper, get those men and follow our trail. We'll try to cut Maddox off at the North Pass." As they mounted, Jonas felt the weight of his father's compass in his vest pocket. For 7 years it had spun aimlessly, unable to find true north. Now it seemed to pull toward Pearl with an urgency he couldn't ignore. "We'll find her," Clara said, reading his expression as she settled into her saddle. "Margaret is a Thompson. They don't break easily." "Her name is Pearl," Jonas corrected, gathering the reins. "And no, she doesn't break easily." They rode hard through the afternoon, following tracks that Maddox had made little effort to conceal. His confidence suggested he either didn't expect pursuit or didn't fear it, both dangerous assumptions that Jonas intended to prove wrong. The trail led north toward Cooper's Creek, then veered east along a ridge that offered views of the surrounding territory. Jonas recognized the tactical choice. High ground provided visibility and defensive advantage. Maddox was thinking like a military man, which confirmed Jonas's suspicions about his background. "They're making for the old mining trail," Brennan called as they crested a rise. "It's the fastest route to the Dakota border." And the most dangerous, Jonas added, remembering the narrow path that clung to the mountainside with sheer drops that had claimed more than one careless traveler. The sun was beginning its westward descent when they caught their first glimpse of the riders ahead. 4 men on horseback, one small figure held before a rider on the lead horse. Pearl's wheat-colored hair caught the fading light, a beacon drawing Jonas forward with renewed determination. "They've seen us," Clara warned as the distant riders suddenly increased their pace. "Good," Jonas said grimly. "Let them hurry on dangerous ground. They're carrying extra weight, and those horses are already tired." The chase narrowed to the mining trail, a treacherous path barely wide enough for a single horse in places. Jonas took the lead, his experience in mountain terrain giving him an edge that Brennan and Clara lacked. He pushed Brennan's bay harder than was wise on such ground, calculating that the risk was justified by the need to close the gap before Maddox reached more favorable terrain. Ahead, the trail curved around a massive outcropping, momentarily hiding the fleeing riders from view. When Jonas rounded the bend, he saw that Maddox had halted his party at a point where the trail widened slightly into a small plateau. The other men had dismounted and taken positions behind Boulder's rifles aimed at the approaching pursuit. Maddox himself remained mounted. Pearl held firmly before him on the saddle. Even from this distance, Jonas could see the child's face was streaked with tears, though her expression was one of anger rather than fear. "That's far enough, Reeves," Maddox called as Jonas reined in his horse. Brennan and Clara drew up beside him, both breathing hard from the punishing ride. "Let the girl go, Maddox," Brennan shouted, his badge catching the late afternoon sun. "You're outnumbered and outgunned. My deputy's bringing a posse that'll be here any minute." Maddox's laugh was cold and confident. "Your deputy is currently explaining to your townsfolk why 3 of their friends were shot. My men made sure the good doctor and the saloon woman had company in their misery." Jonas felt ice form in his veins. More casualties, more lives, destroyed in the pursuit of wealth and power. He studied the positioning of Maddox's men, calculating angles and cover, evaluating the chance of reaching Pearl before bullets found their mark. "It doesn't have to end this way," Jonas called, shifting his weight slightly in the saddle. "Thornberry can't access the Thompson fortune without Pearl alive and legally recognized. You need her unharmed." "Clever, Reeves, but you're assuming Thornberry wants the girl for the trust." Maddox shifted, and Jonas saw Pearl wince as the man's grip tightened. "The truth is much simpler. With Margaret Thompson declared dead, the trust reverts to her next of kin, her Uncle Silas. Her continued existence is actually quite inconvenient." Clara gasped beside him. "You can't mean to harm her." "She's a child. Children die all the time on the frontier," Maddox replied coldly. "Accidents, disease, exposure. No one questions it too closely, especially when the guardian is a man of Thornberry's standing." "Then why take her at all?" Jonas demanded, trying to keep Maddox talking while he inched his horse forward imperceptibly. "Why not just leave her in Cedar Ridge?" "Because she knows too much," Maddox said. "The Henderson woman filled her head with stories before she died. And then there's the matter of the deed. The land was left to the girl, not to Henderson. We need her signature forged, or otherwise to make the claim legitimate." Pearl's voice suddenly rang out clear and defiant despite her tears. "I remember you now. You were at our farm the day before the accident. Papa caught you in the barn with the wagon wheel." Maddox's expression hardened. "Shut up, you little brat." "You killed Mama and Papa," Pearl accused, struggling against his grip. "You made the wheel break on purpose." "I said, shut up," Maddox hissed, clamping his hand over Pearl's mouth. It was the opening Jonas had been waiting for. In one fluid motion, he drew the pistol from his belt and fired, not at Maddox, but at the rock face above one of his hidden men. The bullet struck with precision, sending a shower of stone fragments down on the gunman, who yelled in surprise and pain. In the same instant, Brennan fired at the second hidden man, while Clara spurred her horse forward, drawing fire from the third. The diversion was brief but effective. Jonas launched himself from his saddle toward Maddox's horse, colliding with both man and child in a desperate gamble. They crashed to the ground in a tangle of limbs. Jonas felt the impact jar every bone in his body, but his focus remained singular. Get Pearl away from Maddox. He rolled, pulling the child with him, sheltering her with his body, as Maddox recovered and drew his pistol. "Run to Clara," Jonas ordered, pushing Pearl toward the copper-haired woman who had dismounted and was crouching behind a boulder. Pearl hesitated. "But, Mr. Jonas—" "Go," he commanded, turning to face Maddox as the man's pistol leveled at his chest. Time seemed to slow as it had on battlefields years ago. Jonas saw Maddox's finger tighten on the trigger, saw the flash of gunpowder in the chamber, heard the deafening report of the shot. But the bullet never reached him. Instead, Maddox's expression changed from triumph to shock as a bloom of red appeared on his chest. He staggered, turned, and saw Sheriff Brennan standing with his rifle still raised, smoke curling from the barrel. "No one threatens my town's children," Brennan said grimly as Maddox crumpled to the ground. The remaining gunmen, seeing their leader fall and hearing the approach of hoofbeats that signaled Cooper's posse had finally arrived, threw down their weapons and surrendered. Jonas rushed to where Clara was holding Pearl, checking the child for injuries. She was dusty and tear-stained, with a bruise forming on her cheek where Maddox had gripped her too tightly, but otherwise unharmed. "Mr. Jonas!" she cried, flinging herself into his arms with such force that he nearly toppled backward. "You came for me. You kept your promise." "Always," Jonas murmured, holding her close, feeling her small heart hammering against his chest. "I will always come for you." Over Pearl's head his eyes met Clara's. There was something in her gaze, recognition, perhaps, or understanding, that made him pause. "I know you," he said suddenly, the realization striking him with unexpected force. "Not from San Francisco, from before." Clara nodded slowly. "Yes, Major Reeves. We met once, briefly, in a field hospital near Chickamauga. I was a volunteer nurse. You were barely conscious, calling for someone named Maria." Jonas felt the world shift beneath him. "Maria was my wife. She died giving birth to our son while I was at war. The boy lived only a few hours." "I know," Clara said softly. "Maria was my cousin. I promised her I'd find you after the war, tell you how much she loved you, how bravely she faced the end. But when I finally tracked you to Cedar Ridge, you seemed so determined to be alone with your grief that I couldn't bring myself to intrude." The revelation left Jonas speechless. All these years, a connection to Maria had been in Cedar Ridge, watching from a distance, respecting his pain, even at the cost of her own promise. Pearl looked between them, her young brow furrowed in confusion. "Do you know Miss Clara, Mr. Jonas?" "It seems we do," Jonas replied, still processing the extraordinary coincidence, or perhaps not coincidence at all. Perhaps his father's compass had been working all along, guiding him toward connections he'd been too blind to see. As Cooper's posse secured the prisoners and tended to Maddox's body, Jonas, Pearl, Clara, and Brennan began the long ride back to Cedar Ridge. The sun was setting, painting the western sky in shades of gold and crimson that seemed to promise a better tomorrow. But as they crested the final ridge overlooking the town, that promise turned to ash. Columns of smoke rose from several buildings, including Jonas's workshop. Even from this distance they could see figures moving through the streets, with the purposeful malice of men bent on destruction. "Thornberry," Brennan growled. "He must have had more men waiting nearby." Jonas felt Pearl stiffen before him on the saddle. "My home," she whispered. "He's burning my home." "I've just destroyed your home," Jonas realized with growing dread. "The entire town. He's punishing Cedar Ridge for protecting you." In that moment, holding Pearl close as they watched flames devour the life they'd begun to build together, Jonas understood that their battle was far from over. Silas Thornberry had declared war not just on a child who stood between him and a fortune, but on an entire community that had dared to stand with her. And war was something Jonas Reeves understood all too well. The descent into Cedar Ridge felt like riding into hell itself. Flames leapt from building to building, fed by the dry timber construction and fanned by the evening wind. The methodical nature of the destruction made it clear this was no accidental fire. This was calculated retribution. "We need to get Pearl somewhere safe," Jonas said, scanning the ridge for signs of Thornberry's men. "Then help the town. My place is on the north edge," Brennan replied. "Should be clear of the fires. Clara can take Pearl there while we assess the damage." Jonas hesitated, reluctant to let Pearl out of his sight after nearly losing her. But the town needed every able body, and Brennan's home would be the safest option. "I don't want to go," Pearl protested, her small hands clutching Jonas's arm. "I want to stay with you." "Pearl," Jonas said gently, "I need to help the people of Cedar Ridge. Some of them might be hurt, but I promise I'll come for you as soon as it's safe." Clara guided her horse alongside them. "I'll protect her with my life, Jonas. You have my word." Finally, Jonas nodded. "Take the back trail to Brennan's place. Stay hidden. If you see or hear anything suspicious, ride for the territorial outpost at Willow Creek." After transferring Pearl to Clara's horse, Jonas watched them disappear into the gathering darkness before turning to Brennan. "Where do we start?" "Murphy's," the sheriff decided. "It's central, and Mavis would have coordinated evacuation from there if she's—" He didn't finish the sentence. As they rode into town, the full extent of the devastation became clear. The mercantile was completely engulfed, its roof already collapsed. The boarding house was burning fiercely, though Jonas could see figures moving buckets in a chain, fighting to save what they could. Doc Patterson's surgery appeared intact, but smoke poured from the upstairs windows. Most devastating of all was Jonas's workshop. The wooden structure had burned quickly, leaving only charred timbers and smoldering rubble. 7 years of careful craftsmanship tools collected over a lifetime the small living space he'd shared with Pearl. All gone. The sound of gunfire drew their attention to Murphy's, where several men had taken position on the balcony, exchanging shots with attackers in the street. Brennan immediately spurred his horse toward the saloon, Jonas close behind. They dismounted in the relative safety of an alley approaching the rear entrance, where they found Mavis directing townspeople through to safety. Her face was smudged with soot, and a bloodied bandage wrapped her left arm, but her eyes blazed with fierce determination. "Sheriff Jonas!" she exclaimed, relief evident in her voice. "Thank God! We thought you might be dead after what happened at Doc's." "Doc!" Jonas asked urgently. "Is he?" "Alive?" Mavis confirmed. "Took a bullet to the shoulder, but he'll pull through. He's inside, treating the wounded." "What happened?" Brennan demanded, as they followed her into the smoky interior of the saloon. "They came just after sundown," Mavis explained, leading them past tables where the injured lay on makeshift pallets. "About a dozen men, well armed and organized. Started with your workshop, Jonas, then moved to other buildings. When people tried to fight the fires, they opened fire." Thornberry's men, Jonas said grimly. That's what we figured. Mavis paused by the bar where Doc Patterson was directing two women who were assisting with the wounded. Despite his own injury, the doctor was fully engaged, his weathered face set in lines of concentration as he worked. "Jonas," Doc acknowledged, glancing up briefly. "The girl. Safe with Clara Wellington. Brennan's place." Doc nodded, returning to his patient. "Good. These bastards were asking about her, searching houses, threatening people." Jonas felt cold fury build within him. Pearl had suffered enough loss. Now an entire town was paying the price for protecting her. "How many hostiles still out there?" Brennan asked, checking his ammunition. "Half-dozen, maybe more," Mavis replied. "They seem to be waiting for something. Or someone." As if summoned by her words, the sound of a carriage rattling down the main street reached them. Through the saloon's front windows they could see an elegant black landau pulled by four matched greys, a stark contrast to the destruction surrounding it. The carriage halted in the center of town, and a man descended. Tall and distinguished with silver hair and the kind of face that belonged on banknotes. His expensive suit and polished boots were pristine, as if the ash and smoke dared not settle upon him. "Thornberry," Clara's voice came from behind them. She stood in the doorway, her face pale with tension. Jonas whirled to face her. "Pearl is with Mrs. Patterson upstairs," Clara assured him. "I couldn't stay away, not when he's here, not after everything he's done." Brennan moved to the window, keeping to the shadows. "That's Silas Thornberry." "You're sure?" Clara nodded, her expression hardening. "I'd know him anywhere. The man responsible for Sarah and Thomas's deaths, and God knows how many others." Outside, Thornberry surveyed the burning town with the detached interest of a man examining a minor inconvenience. He gestured to one of his men, who approached with obvious deference. "He's looking for Pearl," Jonas realized. "He won't leave until he finds her." "Then perhaps we should oblige him," came a new voice. Judge William Harrison stood in the doorway to the back room, his normally pristine judicial robes stained with soot and blood. At 60, with a shock of white hair and piercing blue eyes, Harrison was the embodiment of frontier justice, fair but uncompromising. "Judge Harrison," Brennan acknowledged, surprised. "Didn't know you were in town." "Arrived this morning for circuit court," Harrison explained. "Found myself in the middle of this instead." His eyes moved to Jonas. "Mr. Reeves, I understand you've been caring for the child at the center of this maelstrom." Jonas straightened, prepared to defend his guardianship. "Yes, sir. Pearl Henderson, or Margaret Thompson, as some claim." Harrison nodded thoughtfully. "Clara has briefed me on the situation. Quite extraordinary. A child kidnapped, or rescued, depending on one's perspective, then pursued across states by men willing to commit murder for financial gain." "What did you mean about obliging Thornberry?" Brennan asked, returning to the judge's earlier statement. Harrison's weathered face hardened. "I meant that perhaps it's time to confront this man directly in a court of law, rather than a street battle that will only claim more innocent lives." "You want to hold court now?" Mavis asked incredulously. "Half the town's burning. Precisely why we must act," Harrison replied. "Thornberry believes himself above the law, that his money and connections shield him from consequences. Let's put that belief to the test." Jonas shook his head. "He's not here for a legal battle, Judge. He's here for Pearl, and he doesn't care who dies in the process." "Then we use that against him," Harrison said. "Sheriff, you have evidence linking Thornberry to these attacks, to the attempt on the child's life at Cooper's Creek." Brennan nodded. "Maddox's documents, the forged deed testimony from the men we captured. It's circumstantial, but substantial. And I have Sarah Thompson's letter, Clara added. Plus financial records showing Thornberry's payments to Maddox over 5 years. Harrison's expression was grim satisfaction. Then we have enough to issue a territorial warrant for his arrest. Once in custody, he'll face formal charges of conspiracy, attempted kidnapping, destruction of property, and possibly murder. He won't surrender, Jonas warned, not with so much at stake. Perhaps not, Harrison conceded. But an official confrontation changes the stakes. It transforms this from a private vendetta to an act of resistance against territorial authority. Even a man of Thornberry's connections can't simply gun down a judge and sheriff without consequences. Jonas considered the judge's words. The plan had merit. It would force Thornberry to operate within at least the appearance of legal boundaries, potentially reducing the bloodshed. But it also placed Pearl at the center of a dangerous confrontation. "What about Pearl?" he asked. "I won't put her at risk again." "The child remains secure," Harrison assured him. "This is about serving notice to Thornberry that his actions have legal ramifications, not about exposing Margaret to further trauma." "Her name is Pearl," Jonas corrected automatically, then sighed. "I apologize, Judge. It's been a long day." Harrison's expression softened slightly. "No apology needed, Mr. Reeves. A child's identity is more than just a legal designation. It's who they understand themselves to be." He straightened his soiled robes with dignity. "Now, shall we prepare to receive Mr. Thornberry in a manner befitting an officer of the court?" While Brennan organized the town's defense and Judge Harrison prepared formal documents, Jonas slipped upstairs to check on Pearl. He found her in a small room above the saloon, sitting on a narrow bed, with Mrs. Patterson, the doctor's wife, a kind-faced woman who had raised 5 children of her own. "Mr. Jonas!" Pearl cried, launching herself into his arms the moment he appeared in the doorway. "I was so scared when Miss Clara left. Is everyone all right? Is our house really burned down?" Jonas held her close, breathing in the scent of her hair, reassuring himself that she was safe. "A lot of buildings are damaged," he said gently, "including the workshop. But we can rebuild. What matters is that people are safe." Pearl pulled back to look at his face, her eyes searching for the truth. "Are they safe? I mean, Doc Patterson was hurt because of me, and now the whole town is burning because that bad man wants me." "None of this is your fault," Jonas said firmly. "Thornberry is responsible for his own actions. You're just a child caught in his schemes." "But if I went with him, maybe he'd stop hurting people." Pearl suggested, her young face serious with the terrible logic of self-sacrifice. Jonas felt his heart clench at her willingness to offer herself to protect others, a nobility no 7-year-old should have to contemplate. "That's not how men like Thornberry operate," he explained, sitting beside her on the bed. "Once they start hurting people, they don't stop just because they get what they want. They find new reasons, new demands." Mrs. Patterson nodded in agreement. "He's right, child. Men who use violence to solve problems never run out of problems that need violence." Pearl considered this, absently stroking Hope's yarn hair. The doll had somehow survived the day's chaos, clutched in Pearl's arms throughout the ordeal. "What's going to happen now?" she asked finally. "Judge Harrison is going to confront Thornberry," Jonas explained, simplifying the complex legal maneuvers being prepared downstairs. "He's going to make it clear that what Thornberry's doing is against the law, and that he'll be punished for it." "Will that work?" Pearl asked skeptically. "The bad men had guns. Does the judge have guns too?" Despite everything, Jonas found himself smiling at her practical question. The judge has something more powerful than guns. He has the law and the authority to enforce it. Pearl didn't look convinced. Papa always said the law is only as good as the people upholding it. Your papa was a wise man, Jonas acknowledged. But Judge Harrison is one of the good ones, and he has Sheriff Brennan and the people of Cedar Ridge standing with him. And you, Pearl asked, her small fingers finding his hand, will you stand with the judge too? Jonas hesitated. His instinct was to stay with Pearl to shield her from whatever might come, but he also recognized that the true protection she needed now went beyond physical presence. It required ending Thornberry's threat permanently. I need to help confront Thornberry, he said finally, to make sure he can never threaten you again. Pearl nodded solemnly. I understand. But be careful, Mr. Jonas. I don't want to lose another papa. The words struck Jonas with physical force. Another papa. In the midst of chaos and danger, this child had claimed him as family with the simple directness only children possess. You won't lose me, he promised, though he knew it was a vow he might not be able to keep. Now, try to rest. Mrs. Patterson will stay with you. As Jonas descended the stairs, he found the saloon transformed into an impromptu courtroom. Judge Harrison sat behind the bar, which now served as a judicial bench. Brennan stood to one side in his official capacity as sheriff, while Doc Patterson Mavis and other townspeople were positioned as witnesses. Armed men, a mixture of Brennan's deputies and local volunteers, guarded the doors and windows. Clara approached as Jonas reached the bottom step. It's time, she said quietly. Thornberry has been invited to present himself before the court to address charges against him. And if he refuses, then he publicly defies territorial authority, giving Brennan legal grounds to arrest him by force. Clara's expression was grim. Either way, this ends tonight. The Batwing doors swung open, and Silas Thornberry entered Murphy's saloon as if arriving at a social gathering rather than a town he'd ordered destroyed. He was taller than Jonas had expected, with the kind of commanding presence that came from a lifetime of wealth and power. His silver hair was immaculately groomed, his tailored suit unmarred by the destruction outside. Only his eyes betrayed his true nature, cold and calculating, assessing each person in the room as either an asset or an obstacle. Two men flanked him, hands resting on holstered pistols, their stances indicating professional gunmen rather than common thugs. Thornberry surveyed the improvised court with barely concealed disdain before focusing on Judge Harrison. "William," he said, his voice cultured and pleasant, "what an unexpected pleasure. I wasn't aware the territorial circuit included amateur theatricals now." Harrison's expression remained impassive. "Silas Thornberry, you stand before this court to answer charges of conspiracy, attempted kidnapping, arson, and accessory to murder. How do you plead?" Thornberry's laugh held genuine amusement. "Is this a joke, William, or have you finally succumbed to the dementia that runs in your family?" His gaze swept the room, lingering on Jonas with particular interest. "I'm a respected businessman from San Francisco here to claim my niece after years of searching. If anyone should face charges, it's the people who've harbored her illegally." "We have evidence, Thornberry," Brennan stated, stepping forward with a folder of documents. "Maddox's records, the forged deed to the Henderson property, testimony from your hired guns about orders to eliminate witnesses." Thornberry's smile never wavered. "Maddox was an independent contractor with no direct connection to my enterprises. Any actions he took were of his own initiative, likely exceeding his instructions in unfortunate ways. As for documents, I'm sure we can address any administrative irregularities through proper channels. His smooth deflection was practiced, revealing a man accustomed to distancing himself from the consequences of his orders. Jonas felt his hands clench into fists, remembering Pearl's tears, the Hendersons' sabotaged wagon, Doc Patterson's bullet wound. Administrative irregularities. Jonas stepped forward, unable to contain his anger. Is that what you call murder and arson? The destruction of an entire town? Thornberry regarded him with the mild interest one might show an unusual insect. Ah, the carpenter. Jonas Reeves, isn't it? The man who's appointed himself guardian to my niece. His smile turned predatory. Tell me, Mr. Reeves, does the territorial authority typically grant custody of young girls to unmarried men with histories of combat-induced instability? The barb struck its target with precision. Jonas had wondered the same thing himself, whether his war record, particularly the classified operations that had left him with nightmares, would disqualify him as Pearl's guardian in any legal proceeding. That's irrelevant to the charges against you, Judge Harrison interrupted. We're here to address your actions, Mr. Thornberry, not Mr. Reeves's qualifications as a guardian. On the contrary, Thornberry countered smoothly, it's entirely relevant. This entire situation stems from the illegal detention of my niece by various parties, culminating in Mr. Reeves's current obstruction of a lawful guardian's rights. Clara stepped forward, her posture rigid with controlled fury. There was nothing lawful about your guardianship, Silas. Sarah knew what you were capable of. She left explicit instructions that Margaret should never be placed in your care. Thornberry's expression hardened slightly at the sight of Clara. Mrs. Wellington, still interfering in matters that don't concern you, I see. Your obsession with my sister's family has always bordered on the pathological. I have Sarah's letter, Clara replied, holding up the document. Her deathbed testament, naming you as the likely cause of Thomas's death, and expressing fear for Margaret's safety in your custody. For the first time, Thornberry's composure wavered. A forgery, obviously, or the delusions of a woman whose mental state was compromised by grief and illness. And the court will determine its authenticity, Harrison stated, along with other evidence that suggests a pattern of criminal behavior spanning multiple jurisdictions. Thornberry's eyes narrowed, reassessing the situation. I see. And where is Margaret during these proceedings? Surely if this is about her welfare, she should be present. The child is secure, and will remain so, Harrison replied firmly. This hearing concerns your actions, not hers. How convenient, Thornberry observed, his tone deceptively light. A court proceeding about custody that excludes the subject of said custody, almost as if you fear what she might say if questioned directly. Jonas tensed, recognizing the trap being laid. If Pearl were brought to testify, she would be within Thornberry's reach. If she were kept hidden, he would claim the proceedings were invalid without her testimony. Pearl has endured enough trauma, Jonas said. She doesn't need to relive it for your entertainment. Pearl! Thornberry raised an eyebrow. My niece's name is Margaret Thompson. The fact that you persist in using her kidnapper's nomenclature speaks volumes about your intentions, Mr. Reeves. Before Jonas could respond, a small voice came from the staircase. My name is Pearl. All heads turned to see Pearl standing on the steps. Hope clutched to her chest, her wheat-colored hair falling in tangles around a face, set in stubborn determination. Mrs. Patterson stood behind her, looking apologetic. I'm sorry, the older woman whispered to Jonas. She slipped away when I was checking on the other children. Jonas moved instinctively to Pearl's side, positioning himself between her and Thornberry. You shouldn't be here, he murmured. I needed to see him, Pearl replied, her eyes fixed on Thornberry. The man who hurt so many people because of me. Thornberry's expression transformed into one of benevolent concern, a mask so convincing it would have fooled anyone who hadn't seen the coldness in his eyes moments before. "Margaret," he said warmly, taking a step toward her, "my dear niece, you've grown so much since I last saw you. You look just like your mother." Pearl didn't flinch. "My name is Pearl Henderson, and you never saw me before because if you had, I would remember someone with eyes like yours." "Eyes like mine," Thornberry echoed, his tone indulgent. "Yes," Pearl said simply, "cold and empty, like the dead fish at the mercantile." A ripple of surprised laughter moved through the assembled townspeople, quickly suppressed when Thornberry's face darkened. The mask of benevolence slipped, revealing the calculation beneath. "Children often say hurtful things when they've been influenced by those around them," he said, his voice hardening. "Margaret has clearly been turned against her own family by the Hendersons and now by Mr. Reeves. All the more reason she should be returned to proper guidance immediately." "I remember the red-haired lady," Pearl continued as if Thornberry hadn't spoken. "The one who sang to me and smelled like flowers. That's Miss Clara, isn't it? She was kind." Her eyes remained fixed on Thornberry. "And I remember a man with a big voice who called me Little Maggie and gave me candy. But it wasn't you. It was my real uncle, my father's brother, Uncle James." Thornberry's composure fractured visibly. "James Thompson has been dead for 10 years. You couldn't possibly remember him." "But I do," Pearl insisted. "He had a beard that tickled when he kissed my cheek, and he laughed so loud it made the windows shake." Clara gasped softly. "She's right. James had a beard, and his laugh was legendary. He died when Margaret was barely 2, before Silas ever became involved with the Thompson holdings." Judge Harrison leaned forward. "Miss Pearl, are you certain about this memory about your Uncle James?" Pearl nodded solemnly. "I remember lots of things now. They come back in dreams, or when people talk about the past. I remember the big house on the hill and the garden with the stone animals. I remember Mama, my first Mama, crying a lot after Papai died. And I remember him," she pointed at Thornberry, "coming to the house with papers for Mama to sign and Mama saying no, and him getting very angry." Thornberry's face had gone pale. "This is absurd. The fabrications of a child clearly coached." "I remember the night Mary took me away," Pearl continued relentlessly. "She woke me up and said we had to be very quiet, like it was a game. She said my mama had asked her to keep me safe because sometimes families can be dangerous." Her voice wavered slightly. "And the next day, Mary became my new mama, and Frank became my new papa. And we were the Hendersons instead of the Thompsons." The saloon had fallen completely silent, every person transfixed by the child's testimony. Jonas felt a surge of protective pride watching Pearl stand firm against the man who had destroyed so much in pursuit of her inheritance. "Convenient memories," Thornberry sneered, his refined facade crumbling further. "Undoubtedly planted by Mrs. Wellington and her accomplices, none of this would stand in a proper court." "This is a proper court," Judge Harrison stated firmly, "and I find the child's testimony both relevant and compelling." Thornberry's expression shifted to one of cold calculation. "I see how this is to proceed. A frontier kangaroo court presided over by a judge with questionable mental faculties, considering the testimony of a confused child and a collection of rural malcontents." He straightened his already impeccable jacket, a gesture of dismissal. "I had hoped to resolve this matter amicably, but clearly that won't be possible." "Very well. I shall withdraw to make arrangements for a more appropriate legal venue. He turned toward the door, signaling to his men. We'll continue this discussion in San Francisco before judges who understand the complexities of family law and inheritance. You're not going anywhere, Thornberry, Brennan stated, moving to block the exit. Not until these charges are addressed. Thornberry's smile was cold and confident. Sheriff, I have 20 armed men surrounding this establishment. While we've been engaged in this charming theatrical, they've taken positions throughout what remains of your town. I suggest you consider the welfare of your citizens before attempting to detain me. The threat hung in the air, its implications clear. Further resistance would result in more bloodshed, more destruction. Jonas looked around the room at the injured townspeople at Doc Patterson, working tirelessly despite his own wound at Mavis, who had turned her saloon into a sanctuary. Then his eyes fell on Pearl, standing straight-backed and defiant despite her fear. A child who had lost everything twice over, but still found the courage to face her tormentor. A child who deserved better than to spend her life looking over her shoulder, waiting for Thornberry to make another attempt. There's another option, Jonas said, stepping forward. One that ends this without further bloodshed. All eyes turned to him, including Thornberry's cold, assessing gaze. I'm listening, Mr. Reeves, the businessman said with the indulgence of someone humoring a lesser intellect. Trial by combat, Jonas stated the words, falling into the silence like stones into still water. You and me, one-on-one. Murmurs rippled through the room. Brennan looked alarmed while Judge Harrison's expression was unreadable. Pearl clutched Hope tighter, her eyes wide with fear. Thornberry's laugh held genuine amusement. How delightfully primitive. Are you suggesting we duel Mr. Reeves' pistols at dawn, perhaps? No, Jonas replied evenly. I'm suggesting we settle this as men without hiding behind hired guns or legal maneuvering. If you win, you take Pearl, Margaret, back to San Francisco without interference. If I win, you leave Cedar Ridge and never contact Pearl again. All claims to the Thompson estate are relinquished. Mr. Jonas, no, Pearl cried, rushing to his side. He'll cheat. He always cheats. Thornberry studied Jonas with new interest. An intriguing proposition, though decidedly archaic. What form would this combat take? Your choice, Jonas replied. Fists, knives, pistols. But just us two with witnesses to ensure fair play. And why would I agree to such a barbaric resolution when I hold all the tactical advantages? Thornberry inquired, genuinely curious. Because it gives you what you want most, a clean resolution without legal complications, Jonas answered. Win or lose, there would be no charges, no investigations that might uncover other aspects of your business dealings. A simple, direct end to the matter. Thornberry considered this, his calculating mind clearly weighing the advantages against the risks. You were a soldier, Mr. Reeves. A decorated one, if my information is correct. I'm a businessman in my 50s. Hardly seems sporting. You have 20 armed men surrounding this building, Jonas countered. Release them from your service first. Make this truly one against one. A tense silence fell as Thornberry contemplated the offer. Jonas could almost see the man's mind working, assessing probabilities and outcomes, searching for the angle that would serve his interests best. I find your proposition strangely appealing, Mr. Reeves, Thornberry finally said. There's something elemental about it. Perhaps I've spent too long in boardrooms and courthouses, resolving matters through proxies and paperwork. He removed his jacket, handing it to one of his men with deliberate casualness. Very well. Let us settle this like men of a more primitive age. My choice of combat, you said. Jonas nodded, ignoring Brennan's warning look. and Pearl's desperate grip on his hand. "Then I choose fists," Thornberry declared, rolling up his sleeves to reveal surprisingly muscular forearms. "No weapons, no interference. The first man unable to continue loses, and the terms you proposed are binding." Judge Harrison stepped forward. "As the ranking judicial authority present, I will oversee this proceeding. If both parties are in agreement, I will consider the outcome legally binding regarding the guardianship of the child known as Pearl Henderson or Margaret Thompson." "Agreed," Thornberry said smoothly. "Agreed," Jonas echoed gently, disengaging Pearl's hand from his. "Mr. Jonas, please," Pearl whispered, tears streaming down her face. "You don't have to do this." Jonas knelt to her level, to her. "Sometimes we do have to fight, Pearl. Not because we want to, but because it's the only way to protect what matters most." He brushed a tear from her cheek. "No matter what happens, remember that you are loved. By the Hendersons, by Clara, by the people of this town, and by Mater." As Pearl was led away by Mavis, Jonas turned to face Thornberry. The saloon was being cleared to create an open space, tables and chairs pushed against the walls by the townspeople. Judge Harrison stood at one end, his judicial robes lending an incongruous formality to the primitive proceedings. "Gentlemen," Harrison announced, "this contest will determine the legal guardianship of the child in question. The rules are simple. No weapons, no interference from others. The match continues until one contestant yields or is unable to continue. Is that understood?" Both men nodded, circling each other warily. Jonas was taller and broader, with the hardened physique of a working man and soldier. But Thornberry moved with the fluid confidence of someone who had trained in formal boxing, his stance professional and balanced. "I admire your devotion to the child, Reeves," Thornberry remarked conversationally as they circled, "though I question the wisdom of risking your life for someone with no blood connection to you." "Blood isn't what makes family," Jonas replied, measuring the distance between them. "Love is." Thornberry's smile was cold. "How sentimental, and how convenient for a man with no family of his own." The taunt was designed to provoke, to make Jonas attack rashly. Instead, he continued his careful assessment, noting Thornberry's weight distribution, the way he favored his right side slightly, the calculating gleam in his eyes. "No response," Thornberry goaded. "Perhaps you're reconsidering your gallant gesture. It's not too late to yield to admit that a carpenter has no business challenging a man of my standing." Jonas remained silent, watching, waiting. He'd learned patience in the war had developed the stillness that preceded effective action. Thornberry, for all his refinement, was a man accustomed to quick capitulation. His growing frustration at Jonas's restraint would eventually force him to make the first move. It came moments later, a swift professional jab aimed at Jonas's face. Jonas deflected it smoothly, absorbing a second blow to his ribs while measuring Thornberry's reach and speed. The businessman was better trained than expected, his punches precise and powerful. They exchanged blows in earnest, then the sound of fists meeting flesh, punctuated by the collective intake of breath from the spectators. Jonas took several hard hits, feeling the sting of split skin above his eye, tasting blood from a cut lip. But he gave as good as he got, landing solid punches that rocked Thornberry back on his heels. "You're holding back," Thornberry observed during a momentary pause, his own face marked with the beginning of bruises. The famous ghost of Chickamauga, known for lethal efficiency pulling his punches. How disappointing. Jonas didn't rise to the bait. He was indeed holding back, but not from fear or hesitation. He was studying his opponent, learning his patterns, waiting for the right moment to end this definitively. Thornberry attacked again, a flurry of blows that drove Jonas back toward the bar. A hook caught Jonas on the jaw, sending him staggering. Thornberry pressed his advantage, landing several punishing body shots that drove the air from Jonas's lungs. "You see, Reeves," Thornberry said, circling as Jonas fought to regain his breath. "This is the difference between us. You fight with restraint, with rules. I fight to win by any means necessary." As if to emphasize his point, Thornberry's next punch caught Jonas low below the belt, doubling him over in pain. Before Jonas could recover, a knee connected with his face, sending him sprawling across the sawdust-covered floor. "Illegal strike," Brennan called out. "Judge Harrison! Stay back!" Jonas gasped, pushing himself to his knees. Blood dripped from his nose, spattering the floor. "No interference." Thornberry circled confident now, believing victory was within reach. "Noble to the end. This is why men like you lose, Reeves. You cling to principles, while the world runs on power and ruthlessness." Jonas rose slowly, his breathing labored, but his eyes clear. "You're wrong, Thornberry. Men like you lose because you never understand what's worth fighting for." With a speed that belied his injured state, Jonas surged forward. His first blow caught Thornberry by surprise, snapping the man's head back. The second drove into his solar plexus, folding him forward. The third, a devastating uppercut, delivered with the full force of Jonas's powerful frame, lifted Thornberry off his feet and sent him crashing into the bar. Thornberry slumped to the floor, dazed, but not unconscious. Jonas stood over him, blood streaming from his nose and split eyebrow, but upright and unwavering. "Yield!" Jonas demanded, his voice rough with exertion. Thornberry's hand moved suddenly, and Jonas saw the flash of steel. A small derringer pulled from a hidden pocket. The businessman's eyes blazed with hatred as he aimed the weapon at Jonas's chest. "I never agreed to lose," Thornberry snarled. The gunshot was deafening in the confined space of the saloon. Jonas felt no impact, no pain beyond his existing injuries. Instead, he watched in shock as Thornberry's expression changed from triumph to confusion, then to blank surprise as he slumped sideways, the derringer falling from limp fingers. Behind him stood Pearl, Doc Patterson's shotgun, clutched in her small hands, the barrel still smoking. Her face was pale, but resolute, her eyes wide, but clear. "You were right, Mr. Jonas," she said in the stunned silence that followed. "Some men don't stop until someone makes them stop." The aftermath of a gunshot has a quality unlike any other sound, a ringing silence that seems to suspend time itself. In that frozen moment, Jonas stared at Pearl, at the shotgun in her small hands, at the determination in her young face that no child should ever have to show. Then time rushed forward again. Brennan moved swiftly to check Thornberry, who lay crumpled against the bar. Clara ran to Pearl, gently taking the shotgun and gathering the child into her arms. Doc Patterson pushed through the stunned crowd, medical instincts overriding everything else. "He's alive," Brennan announced, his fingers finding a pulse in Thornberry's neck. Shot went wide, but he hit his head when he fell. Out cold. Jonas felt a wave of relief wash over him, not for Thornberry's sake, but for Pearl's. The burden of taking a life, even in defense of another, was one he wouldn't wish on anyone, let alone a 7-year-old who had already endured too much. "Pearl?" he said, moving toward her despite his injuries. "Are you all right?" She looked up from Clara's embrace, her face pale but composed. "I didn't aim to kill him," she said with unsettling clarity. "I just wanted to stop him from hurting you. The shotgun was heavy, so it pulled down when I fired." Jonas knelt before her, ignoring the protest of his battered body. "You shouldn't have had to do that. I'm sorry." Pearl reached out to touch his bruised face, her small fingers gentle against his swollen cheek. "You said sometimes we have to fight, to protect what matters. You matter to me, Mr. Jonas." The simple declaration struck deeper than any of Thornberry's blows. In that moment, Jonas understood with perfect clarity that whatever legal battles lay ahead, whatever complications might arise from this night's events, his commitment to this child was immutable. No court, no document, no technicality of blood or law could change the bond that had formed between them. "Let's get you both looked at," Clara suggested, her arm still around Pearl's shoulders. "Doc, are you able to—" "I can manage," Doc Patterson assured her, already directing Jonas to a chair. "Head wounds bleed dramatically, but aren't necessarily serious. Let me see what we're dealing with here." As Doc examined Jonas's injuries, Judge Harrison approached his judicial robes, now covered with Thornberry's blood, where he had helped Brennan move the unconscious man to a makeshift cot. "Remarkable child," Harrison commented, his eyes on Pearl as Clara led her to a quiet corner where Mrs. Patterson waited with blankets and comfort. "Quick thinking saved your life, Reeves." Thornberry had killing in his eyes. "She shouldn't have been there at all," Jonas said, grimly wincing as Doc probed a particularly tender spot above his eye. "We were supposed to be protecting her, not the other way around." "Children often understand more than we give them credit for," Harrison replied. Pearl recognized what was at stake better than most adults would have. "What happens now?" Jonas asked, the question encompassing far more than the immediate aftermath. "Legally, I mean." Harrison considered this, his weathered face thoughtful. "Thornberry violated the terms of your agreement by drawing a weapon. That alone invalidates any claim he might have had to the child's guardianship. Additionally, we have substantial evidence of criminal activity, enough to hold him for trial once he regains consciousness." "And Pearl," Jonas pressed. "If she is Margaret Thompson, what happens to her?" "That," Harrison said with surprising gentleness, "will depend largely on what you and the child will want. There are legal procedures to be followed, of course. The Thompson estate will need proper administration, but in my experience, courts generally recognize existing bonds of affection when determining a child's placement, particularly in cases involving trauma and recovery." Patterson interrupted with a grunt of professional satisfaction. "Nothing broken, though you'll be sore for weeks. That cut above your eye needs stitches, and I'd wager you've cracked a rib or two, but you'll heal." Jonas nodded his thanks, his eyes still on Pearl across the room. "What about her? Will she heal from this?" "Children are remarkably resilient," Doc replied, preparing a needle and catgut for the stitches, "especially when they have stability and love. She's already survived losing 2 sets of parents, Jonas. With proper care, she'll survive this too." Outside, the first pale light of dawn was breaking over Cedar Ridge. The fires had mostly burned themselves out, leaving a pall of smoke hanging over the devastated town. As Doc stitched his wounds, Jonas could hear Brennan organizing recovery efforts, dispatching men to secure Thornberry's remaining henchmen and begin salvage operations. "The workshop is gone," Jonas said quietly, more to himself than to Doc. "Everything I've built for 7 years. Buildings can be rebuilt," Doc replied, tying off a stitch with practiced precision. "Tools replaced. It's the people who matter, and most of them survived this night thanks to quick action and sheer stubbornness." Jonas knew Doc was right, but the loss still cut deep. The workshop had been more than a business. It had been his sanctuary, the one place where the ghosts of war and personal tragedy had receded enough to allow him moments of peace. It had also been Pearl's first true haven since losing the Hendersons, the place where she had begun to heal. "We'll rebuild," Clara said, approaching as Doc finished the last stitch. "All of it. The workshop, the town, our lives." She glanced back at Pearl, who had finally succumbed to exhaustion and was sleeping under Mrs. Patterson's watchful eye. Sarah left provisions in her will for Margaret's welfare, funds that Silas could never access. "As her godmother, I can authorize their release now that we've confirmed her identity." Jonas shook his head. "I don't want Thompson money. Pearl and I will manage on our own." Clara's expression softened. "It's not about charity, Jonas. It's about giving Pearl, Margaret, what rightfully belongs to her, what her parents wanted her to have, including the choice of who raises her and where she lives." Before Jonas could respond, a commotion at the door drew their attention. A group of men entered, led by a tall figure in the distinctive uniform of a territorial marshal. At his side walked a woman whose resemblance to Clara was unmistakable, though her copper hair was streaked with gray, and her face bore the lines of one who had known both joy and sorrow in equal measure. "Sarah," Clara whispered, her voice choked with disbelief. The woman's eyes found Clara across the crowded saloon, and her face transformed with recognition and relief. "Clara," she called, moving swiftly toward them. "Thank God you're safe." Clara stood frozen, her face pale with shock. "It can't be. You died 5 years ago. I attended your funeral." Sarah Thompson, for it was indeed she, reached her friend and took her hands. "A necessary deception, one that broke my heart to inflict on you, but I couldn't risk Silas discovering the truth until Margaret was safe." "I don't understand," Clara said, tears streaming down her face. Why?" "It's a long story," Sarah replied, her eyes moving to where Pearl slept. Is that my Maggie?" Jonas rose despite his injuries, instinctively moving to place himself between Pearl and this new development. "Her name is Pearl," he said firmly, "and I think you owe us all an explanation before anything else happens." Sarah turned to him, really seeing him for the first time. Despite the bruises and stitches, despite the defensive posture, she smiled with genuine warmth. "You must be Jonas Reeves, the man who saved my daughter's life." She extended her hand. "I can never thank you enough for what you've done." Jonas hesitated, then accepted the handshake, finding her grip firm and sincere. "I didn't save her. If anything, she saved me." "That sounds like my daughter," Sarah said, her voice thick with emotion. "Strong-willed and brave, even as a toddler." The territorial marshal stepped forward, introducing himself as Marshal Daniel Blackwood. "Mrs. Thompson has been under our protection for the past 4 years, he explained. "Part of a larger investigation into Silas Thornberry's business dealings, which we suspect include fraud, embezzlement, and several suspicious deaths." "Including my husband's," Sarah added, her expression hardening. "Thomas discovered evidence that Silas had been embezzling from company accounts and confronted him. 3 days later, there was an accident at the mine." "But your death," Clara began, still struggling to process her friend's resurrection, "was falsified with the help of Marshal Blackwood's office," Sarah confirmed. "We had evidence against Silas, but not enough to bring charges that would stick given his connections. And I knew he would come after Margaret next, the only remaining obstacle to his controlling the Thompson fortune." "So you sent her away with the Hendersons," Jonas concluded. Sarah nodded, tears filling her eyes. "Mary was more than a nanny. She was my dearest friend. She and Frank agreed to take Margaret far from San Francisco to raise her as their own until it was safe for me to reclaim her. We staged my death shortly after allowing me to work with the marshals while searching for evidence against Silas. Why not just take Pearl, Margaret, yourself? Jonas asked the question that seemed most obvious. Because Silas would never have stopped hunting us, Sarah explained. A mother and daughter traveling alone would have been too easy to track. But a childless couple suddenly appearing with a young daughter raised fewer questions, especially in frontier communities where documentation is minimal. Clara had regained her composure, though tears still streaked her face. "And you couldn't tell me after everything we shared." "I wanted to," Sarah said, her voice breaking. "But the fewer people who knew, the safer Margaret would be. Your grief had to be genuine for the deception to work." She squeezed Clara's hands. "Forgive me, dear friend. I never meant to cause you such pain." While the two women embraced, Marshal Blackwood continued his explanation. "We've been tracking Thornberry's operations for years, building a case strong enough to counter his political connections. When we received word that he was suddenly interested in Wyoming property holdings, we suspected he might have located Margaret. Mrs. Thompson insisted on coming immediately." "You're too late," Jonas said, gesturing to where Thornberry lay unconscious under guard. The situation resolved itself. Blackwood raised an eyebrow. "So I see. Judge Harrison has already briefed me on the night's events. Quite extraordinary." His gaze moved to Pearl, still sleeping peacefully, despite the conversation nearby. "The child has been through a remarkable ordeal." "Her name is Pearl," Jonas repeated the words, a statement of identity as much as a correction. "And yes, she has endured more than any child should have to." Sarah followed his gaze, her expression softening into maternal longing. May I see her? Just look at her. I won't wake her." Jonas hesitated, then nodded. He led Sarah to where Pearl slept, her small form curled around Hope, the cloth doll clutched protectively to her chest. Sarah knelt beside the makeshift bed, tears flowing freely now as she studied the daughter she hadn't seen in 5 years. "She's beautiful," Sarah whispered. "So grown, so much like her father." Her hand hovered above Pearl's wheat-colored hair, not quite touching. "I've dreamed of this moment for so long, imagined 1,000 reunions, but I never pictured her like this, so changed, so complete without me." Jonas recognized the mixture of joy and grief in Sarah's eyes, the happiness of finding her child alive and well-tempered by the realization of all she had missed, all the moments that could never be recaptured. "She remembers you," he said quietly. "Not clearly, perhaps, but she remembers a lady with red hair who sang to her and smelled like flowers." Sarah looked up, hope blazing in her eyes. "Truly, she remembers me." "She remembers being loved," Jonas confirmed. "By you, by the Hendersons, by everyone who has tried to protect her along the way." "And by you," Sarah added perceptively. "That much is obvious from how you speak of her, how you position yourself between her and potential threats. Even me." Jonas didn't deny it. "She offered me a silver dollar to be her father," he said simply. "It seemed like a fair trade at the time." Sarah's laugh was soft and bittersweet. "My practical Maggie, always making deals and arrangements, even as a toddler." She sighed, looking back at her sleeping daughter. "What happens now? Mr. Reeves, you've clearly formed a bond with my child, one I have no wish to sever abruptly. Yet, she is my daughter, my only remaining connection to Thomas." It was the question Jonas had been dreading since the moment he recognized Sarah Thompson for who she was. By blood and law, Pearl, or Margaret, belonged with her mother. The woman who had risked everything to protect her, who had sacrificed 5 years of her life to bring her brother to justice, who had never stopped searching for her child. But in his heart, Pearl was his daughter now. Not by birth, but by choice. The choice Pearl had made when she offered him her silver dollar, the choice he had made when he promised to protect her, the choices they had both reaffirmed through fear and fire, and the long night just ended. Before Jonas could formulate a response, Pearl stirred her eyes, fluttering open. She looked first at Jonas, a smile of recognition and trust lighting her face. Then her gaze shifted to Sarah, and she went very still, studying the copper-haired woman with the intense focus children reserve for solving important puzzles. "I know you," Pearl said finally, her voice small but certain. "You're the lady from my dreams, the one who sang about butterflies and stars." Sarah nodded, unable to speak through her tears. Pearl sat up slowly, still clutching hope. "You're my first mama, aren't you, from before?" "Yes, sweetheart," Sarah managed. "I'm your mother. Your name is Margaret Thompson." Pearl considered this solemnly. "That's why the bad man wanted me. Because of that name." "Partly," Sarah acknowledged, "but mostly because of what the name represents, money and property that he wanted to control." "Is he still going to try to take me away?" Pearl asked, looking to Jonas for reassurance. "No," Jonas assured her. "Marshal Blackwood will make sure Thornberry faces justice for everything he's done." Pearl nodded, accepting this with the pragmatism that had helped her survive so much upheaval. She turned back to Sarah, studying her with that uncanny perceptiveness. "You had to go away to keep me safe," she said, not a question, but a statement of understanding. "Like Mama and Papa Henderson took me away to keep me safe." "Yes," Sarah whispered. "Leaving you was the hardest thing I've ever done. Not a day passed that I didn't think of you, pray for you, search for some word of your safety." Pearl digested this, her small brow furrowed in thought. Then, with the directness only children can manage, she asked the question that would determine all their futures. "Do I have to choose between being Margaret with you and being Pearl with Mr. Jonas?" The question hung in the air between them, its implications vast and complex. Sarah looked at Jonas, a silent communication passing between adults who both loved the same child. "No, sweetheart," Sarah said finally. "You don't have to choose. Names are just words we use to know each other by. You can be Pearl Margaret, or Margaret Pearl, or simply the wonderful girl you've always been, regardless of what we call you." "But where will I live?" Pearl persisted, cutting to the heart of the matter. "With you or with Mr. Jonas?" Sarah took a deep breath. "That's something we all need to discuss. Your safety has always been my primary concern, and now that Thornberry is no longer a threat, we have choices we didn't have before." "Cedar Ridge is home now," Pearl said firmly. "Mr. Jonas and I were going to rebuild his workshop, and I was going to learn to make furniture, and—" Her voice faltered as she looked around at the damaged saloon, remembering the destruction outside. "But everything's burned." "Not everything," Jonas said, finding his voice at last. "Buildings can be rebuilt. It's the people who matter, remember." Pearl nodded, her expression brightening slightly. "Like Doc said." "Exactly like Doc said," Jonas confirmed. "And Cedar Ridge has some of the best people I've ever known." "I've never been to Wyoming," Sarah mused, her eyes meeting Jonas's with a warmth that suggested possibilities rather than conflict. "San Francisco holds too many painful memories now, too many shadows of Silas's influence." "Are you saying—" Jonas began, hardly daring to hope. "I'm saying that perhaps there's room in Cedar Ridge for another new beginning," Sarah replied. "For all of us." Pearl looked between them, hope dawning on her small face. "You mean we could all stay here together?" "If that's what you want," Sarah said gently, "and if Mr. Reeves is amenable to the arrangement." Jonas felt something unlock in his chest, a tension he hadn't fully acknowledged until it released. "I think we could manage that," he said, his voice rough with emotion. The workshop was due for an expansion anyway. Pearl's smile was like sunrise after the longest night, illuminating the dusty saloon with renewed hope. "And we can still rebuild, all of us together." All of us together, Jonas confirmed, including not just himself and Sarah in the promise, but Clara, the Pattersons, Mavis Brennan, and all the others who had stood against darkness to protect a child who had come to represent the heart of their community. 6 months later, on a crisp autumn afternoon, Cedar Ridge celebrated the grand opening of Reeves and Thompson Fine Woodcraft. The new workshop stood on the site of the old one, but expanded to accommodate increased business and living quarters for the unusual family that had formed from tragedy and triumph. Jonas stood on the porch watching as Pearl, who now answered to both names with equal ease, demonstrated the proper use of a lathe to a group of children. At 10, she had shot up in height, her wheat-colored hair now neatly braided, her face filled out from regular meals and constant care. Hope sat on a nearby shelf, still treasured, though less frequently clutched, a reminder of darker days, now firmly in the past. "She has your talent for teaching," Sarah observed, joining him on the porch. The past months had seen her transition from grieving widow to active partner in both business and community, her organizational skills complementing Jonas's craftsmanship in ways neither had anticipated. "And your head for business," Jonas replied, watching as Pearl concluded her demonstration with a formal bow that made the other children laugh. "I've never seen anyone drive a harder bargain on lumber prices." Sarah smiled, her copper hair catching the afternoon light. Thompson determination combined with Henderson practicality and Reeves craftsmanship. "She's a formidable combination of all her inheritances." The word inheritance no longer carried the weight of danger it once had. With Thornberry serving a life sentence for multiple crimes, the Thompson estate had been properly settled. Pearl would come into a substantial fortune when she reached adulthood, but for now, the funds were managed by a trust administered jointly by Sarah and Clara, with provisions for education, community development, and the expansion of businesses like Jonas's workshop. Cedar Ridge itself had risen from the ashes, rebuilt with stronger materials and renewed purpose. Doc Patterson's surgery now included a proper hospital wing funded in part by Thompson money. Mavis had expanded Murphy's into a respectable hotel, though the saloon remained its heart. Even Mrs. Hutchkins had found redemption of sorts, now employed as housekeeper for Judge Harrison, who had taken up permanent residence in the town after witnessing its resilience firsthand. "Mr. Jonas, Mama." "Look what I made," Pearl called, running toward them with a small wooden box clutched carefully in her hands. She had taken to calling Sarah Mama, and Jonas Papa Jonas, a compromise that acknowledged all her family connections without diminishing any. The box was simple but beautifully crafted, the joints fitted with precision that would have done credit to an adult craftsman. Pearl opened it proudly to reveal a velvet-lined interior with 2 special depressions. "It's for these," she explained, reaching into her pocket to produce her silver dollar and Jonas's brass compass. "So they'll always stay together like us." Jonas felt his throat tighten with emotion as Pearl placed the 2 objects in their custom-fitted spaces, the silver dollar that had brought them together and the compass that had finally found its true north. "There's room for one more thing," Pearl added, pointing to a 3rd depression in the velvet. She looked expectantly at Sarah. "Do you still have it?" Sarah reached into her own pocket, withdrawing a small golden locket that had once held miniature portraits of herself and Thomas. "Are you sure, sweetheart? This was meant to be yours when you were older?" Pearl nodded solemnly. "It belongs with the other treasures, past, present, and future all together." As Sarah placed the locket in the final depression, the three of them stood in silence, acknowledging the journey that had brought them to this moment. A journey of loss and discovery, of endings and beginnings, of family formed not just by blood, but by choice. Later that evening, after the celebration had concluded, and Pearl was asleep in her room, a proper bedroom now, with a window that didn't leak, and shelves for her growing collection of books, Jonas sat on the porch with Sarah, watching the stars emerge above Cedar Ridge. "She asked me something interesting today," Sarah said, her voice thoughtful in the gathering darkness. "She wanted to know if you and I might ever get married." Jonas nearly choked on his coffee. "She what?" Sarah laughed softly. "Don't look so terrified, Jonas. I told her that adults need time to know each other properly before making such decisions." "And what did she say to that?" Jonas asked, still recovering from the shock. "She said, 'But Papa Jonas has known you forever through me, and you've known him the same way. Isn't that enough?'" Sarah's smile was visible even in the dim light. "Out of the mouths of babes." Jonas felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the coffee. Over the months of rebuilding both town and lives, he and Sarah had developed a partnership based on mutual respect and shared purpose. That it might evolve into something more had occurred to him, though he had kept such thoughts private out of respect for Sarah's loss and Pearl's adjustment. "Pearl has always been remarkably perceptive," he observed carefully. "Indeed," Sarah agreed. She also pointed out that the workshop has plenty of room for expansion should our family continue to grow. The implication hung in the air between them, neither a commitment nor a dismissal, but a possibility to be explored in its own time. "Well," Jonas said, finally finding his voice, "she does have her mother's head for business planning." Sarah's laughter joined the night sounds of Cedar Ridge, the distant piano from Murphy's, the occasional whinny of horses, the soft conversation of neighbors enjoying the cool evening air. Sounds of a community that had faced destruction and emerged stronger, bound together by the kind of courage that builds rather than destroys. Inside the workshop, Pearl's wooden box sat on a shelf of honor containing the three treasures that represented their unusual family's journey: a silver dollar that had purchased not a person, but a promise; a compass that had found its direction after years of aimless spinning; and a locket that connected past to present, ensuring that nothing truly valuable was ever lost. Outside, the stars wheeled overhead, mapping their ancient routes across the Wyoming sky. Jonas Reeves, once lost in grief and isolation, now found himself centered in a life richer than any he could have imagined, when a barefoot orphan had approached him with an impossible question and a silver dollar. Some prices, he reflected, watching the stars with Sarah by his side, and Pearl sleeping safely nearby, were more than fair after all. End of Part 5 story. Complete retry. Claude can make mistakes. Please double-check responses. Research Sonnet 3.7.